Welcome, traveler, to the downright bizarre world of medieval intimacy, a world where foreplay might mean politely asking and hoping nobody's watching, where privacy is more myth than fact, and where even a chicken in the corner seemed involved in your personal affairs. So before we dim the lights and lean back into this strange and smoky chapter of history, take a breath, get comfortable, and let your imagination travel back in time, not to a world of silk sheets and candlelit chambers, but to a single-room hut shared with your entire family, 2 goats, a snoring grandparent, and a chicken that never rests. Because in medieval Europe, connection didn't begin with romance, it began with logistics. The medieval home was less a house and more a survival pod, where kitchen, bedroom, barn, and nursery all competed for the same drafty corner. Privacy, as we know it today, was non-existent. If a couple wanted alone time, it meant getting creative. Maybe the kids were asleep. Maybe grandma was snoring just loud enough to muffle other sounds. Maybe a curtain could be drawn if they were lucky enough to have one. Even nobles with their velvet and gold were rarely alone. Servants often slept at the foot of the bed or stood quietly nearby, pretending not to hear or see. And yet people made do. They always do. The church, of course, had plenty to say about closeness between partners. It was watching, listening, judging. In its view, the only valid reason for physical connection was to create children, not for enjoyment, not for emotional closeness, not even for comfort. Anything else? Distracting at best, spiritually unwise at worst. And they weren't shy about setting guidelines. Bishops, theologians, and confessors wrote detailed instructions outlining what was acceptable, when, and in what manner. Entire days were considered off-limits. Feast days, fast days, Sundays, Wednesdays, Lent, Advent. Want to spend time with your spouse in April? Hopefully, it's a Tuesday. There were, in fact, more restricted days than permitted ones. Some guides marked nearly half the year as unsuitable. You had to be fortunate, prepared, married, and well-timed, and that was just to begin. Even within marriage, expectations were rather strict. One 13th century guide advised that married couples should come together without enjoyment, without error, and without hesitation. A checklist that could diminish the mood faster than a summer heat wave and no shade. The commonly used position wasn't just widespread, it was officially recommended, considered the most respectful option in the eyes of religious authorities. Anything more expressive, heartfelt, or especially cheerful that was often discouraged. Some confessors even asked specific detailed questions during confession, not vague or general, but surprisingly precise ones that made you wonder whether friars knew more about households than their neighbors did. But enforcement was thankfully inconsistent. While some clergy strictly upheld moral rules, many others chose to focus on more pressing concerns, especially in rural communities where people lived closer to nature than to doctrine. These villagers were more focused on surviving winter than debating spiritual interpretations of a Tuesday night conversation. Gossip, however, remained a constant presence. In towns where walls were thin and curiosity was thick news from the hayloft rarely stayed there. And then there were the noble households, homes filled with expectations, scrutiny, and oversight. Bedrooms were often documented for legal or religious purposes, awkward as that may sound. Servants sometimes served as silent observers, noting adherence to expected conduct. While peasants might escape attention thanks to distance and modesty, nobles had no such luck. Their reputations, inheritances, and alliances all depended on upholding appearances, ones that didn't include affectionate whispers or cheerful conversations after dark. Romance, too, was more practical than passionate. Marriage was largely a formal agreement: livestock for land daughters, for peace treaties, personal affection optional. Families arranged these unions like chess matches. A noble daughter might be exchanged for a small farm, and a mutual agreement not to trespass into each other's cabbage patch. Courtship was carefully monitored, sometimes quite literally. Holding hands usually required the approval of multiple relatives. Among peasants, affection could grow, but it had to be quiet, hidden behind barn doors, or whispered out of earshot. Still, human connection finds a way. Despite the rules, restrictions, and expectations, people smiled, teased, held hands under moonlight, and shared secrets at market stalls. They sang love songs, wrote thoughtful verses, and gave heartfelt gifts, sometimes flowers, sometimes eggs. They shared quiet moments behind haystacks and occasionally were caught and gently scolded for it. In small communities, everyone knew each other's stories. One misstep might bring a sermon or a wedding or just a lot of raised eyebrows. And then there's the idea of the chastity belt. A popular trope in stories and souvenirs, it brings to mind elaborate devices and overly protective husbands. But the truth is simpler. They probably weren't real, not widespread, not practical. Most of the examples we have today were created much later as novelties or curiosities. Medieval writings, so eager to describe everything else, don't mention them. And honestly, with the hygiene challenges of the time, a complicated iron device would have caused more problems than it solved. Instead, faithfulness was encouraged through traditional means, reputation, supervision, and community values. Noble women were carefully watched. Village girls had entire communities observing them. And if scandal did occur, consequences ranged from lost dowries to lifelong whispers. Still, it wasn't all rules and restraint. While some lived strictly by religious teachings, many others followed their hearts and used common sense. They shared closeness when the rain fell, when the fire warmed the room, or when the children finally dozed off. They whispered under covers and behind fences. They cared for each other in quiet, careful ways. Even in a world filled with sermons and standards, love found its rhythm. So tonight, as you relax and let the medieval mist roll in, remember this: the past was never as strict as it seemed. Behind every rule was a bit of improvisation. Behind every curtain, a story. And behind every connection, quiet, gentle, or a little bold, was a glimpse of humanity shining through the straw. Now, sleep well, dear listener. And if you dream of stone cottages, candlelight, or a stern monk peeking around a curtain, don't worry. It's just history keeping watch. Let's begin with the biggest misconception about medieval intimacy: the setting. Popular culture loves to imagine medieval lovers behind heavy velvet curtains, tucked into grand four-poster beds in candlelit stone chambers, with the gentle strum of a lute echoing somewhere off-screen. In reality, forget silk sheets and romantic solitude. Most people lived in single-room homes, if you could even call them that, shared not just with their children, but often with aging grandparents, apprentices, livestock, and the occasional opinionated chicken. Privacy, as we understand it today, simply didn't exist. The medieval peasant's home was a patchwork of functions crammed into one dark, drafty room. The kitchen was the bedroom. The bedroom was also the storage area. The stable, usually just a few paces away, if not directly under the same thatched roof. The living room was where you cooked over an open flame, stored grain, and yes, sometimes gave birth or passed away. If a couple wanted alone time, they had to rely on cunning and timing. Wait until the children were asleep. Hope the in-laws were facing the wall. Maybe pull a coarse wool blanket across a makeshift curtain rod and pretend it was privacy. Curtains were a luxury, beds were shared, and volume control was crucial. As one historian jokingly put it, foreplay often meant asking politely and hoping no one was listening. Even the upper classes fared little better in terms of solitude. Though they had more space, they also had more people, servants, guards, scribes visiting relatives, many of whom slept at the foot of the bed or in the same room altogether. Some noble homes even kept written records of who was sleeping where and with whom for legal or religious purposes. It's exactly as awkward as it sounds. So the next time someone tells you about the romance of the Middle Ages, picture this instead: a cold floor, a lumpy straw mattress, 6 other people snoring nearby, and a goat watching you suspiciously from the corner. Because in medieval Europe, love wasn't just about finding the right person. It was also about finding the right moment and the rare blessing of even a hint of personal space. And if a crowded one-room home made intimacy awkward, then the church made it positively perilous. Because in medieval Europe, you weren't just sharing your private life with your family, your livestock, and your neighbors. You were sharing it with God, the saints, and the ever-watchful eyes of the clergy. The church wasn't merely a spiritual authority. It was a regulator of households, a guardian of calendars, and an ever-present influence in your most personal moments. From the pulpit to the confessional, it laid down rules, not vague suggestions, but detailed, specific, often surprising guidelines about who could do what, when, and how. Let's be clear, the church wasn't against closeness. It supported families, but it strongly emphasized that the main purpose of physical connection was to welcome new life, not emotional bonding, not relaxation, certainly not enjoyment. Anything outside that narrow scope, at best a distraction, at worst, a moral danger that could impact not only your spirit, but your reputation, your marriage, and should the wrong monk be listening, your next confession. These weren't just abstract ideas whispered in monasteries. Theologians, bishops, and confessors wrote extensive manuals outlining what actions were permitted, what raised concerns, and what was best avoided. Some guides offered checklists for the faithful. Others emphasized the proper mindset, modesty, restraint, no excessive noise, and certainly no visible delight. Even married couples were advised not to become overly affectionate. Emotional closeness was acceptable. Too much physical enthusiasm, a little too close to chaos. Certain days were entirely restricted: Sundays for being the Lord's Day, Fridays for reflection, Wednesdays for unclear but firm reasons. Then came the feast days of saints, dozens of them, and the longer seasons like Lent and Advent. According to some records, nearly half the year was considered unsuitable for marital relations. One priest in the 13th century calculated only 44 acceptable days in a year. That's shorter than a long Lent and far from ideal. And timing wasn't the only concern. There were expectations around cleanliness, around mindset, around moderation. One well-known guide warned couples to avoid connection if they were too affectionate, too cheerful, or too emotionally attached, lest they risk crossing a moral boundary through too much love. That same guide advised that any marital act should be approached with restraint, without fault, and without delay, a motto that might cause even Cupid to lose his enthusiasm. Confession was where theory met reality. Priests were instructed to ask married couples specific questions about their habits, not to shame them, but to guide them. Did you come together during a feast day? Did you seek closeness rather than purpose? Did you engage in discouraged practices? These weren't jokes. These were serious spiritual reflections, written down, recorded, and in some cases, followed by a recommendation for penance. Imagine kneeling in confession, quietly admitting to a moment of warmth, only to be reminded that it was the wrong day on the calendar. Still, practice varied. Some priests followed the rules strictly. Others offered gentler counsel. In rural areas where clergy were fewer and life more practical, the expectations were often applied with flexibility. Peasants nodded along and returned to their haystacks. But in towns and noble courts, where religious presence was strong and reputation mattered, the pressure was very real. Records exist of nobles being fined, publicly corrected, or assigned penance for improper displays of closeness. One bishop even advised a couple to limit their connection to once a month and encouraged them to redirect their feelings through prayer. They understandably were not pleased. The church didn't just shape behavior, it shaped belief. It taught people that desire, even within marriage, was a source of caution. That joy needed boundaries, that too much affection could open the door to temptation. Saints were upheld as examples, many of whom took vows of celibacy or described living with their spouses as siblings. Abstinence was ideal. Physical closeness at best was a necessity. This mindset appeared in sermons, confessions, and even wedding vows. Some couples chose celibacy after children, hoping to grow spiritually by stepping back from the physical. Others were praised for practicing incontinence, not the medical condition, but the voluntary act of lifelong restraint. To be married and self-disciplined was the model of Christian virtue. Passion belonged to the world, and the world the church often reminded could not always be trusted. And yet life went on. People cared. They whispered by candlelight. They held hands behind church pews. They sought comfort and connection during quiet moments, whether or not the calendar agreed. Because while the church may have defined the framework, the heart didn't always follow schedules. Still, the church's influence lingered. In artwork, where affection was often paired with caution. In stories, where restraint led to virtue. In law, where court decisions could annul a union not only for absence of intimacy, but sometimes for too much of it. In every parish, in every whispered confession, the church's voice was a quiet constant, like incense or smoke from a long burned-out candle. The irony, of course, is that while abstinence was preached, it wasn't always practiced. Priests and monks were expected to lead by example, yet many records describe secret relationships, hidden families, and private transgressions. Some monasteries became known for quiet missteps. Others built high walls, not just to protect their gardens, but to shield the view from curious neighbors. The ideal was firm. Reality, as always, more complicated. And yet, despite all the guidelines, the fears and the teachings, people still found ways to love, quietly, tenderly, resiliently. And perhaps in the end, even the church understood that. Why else preserve the Song of Songs, a poem so rich in longing and metaphor that even monks read it with reverence and wonder? Because even in a world of rules, love, gentle, imperfect, and enduring, finds its way. So tonight, as you drift into rest, think not of rules or guilt, but of quiet warmth shared in stillness, of fingers brushed under candlelight, of hearts reaching toward each other gently in a world that often tried to hold them apart. Sleep well, dear listener. Tomorrow, we'll continue our journey through curious traditions and ancient calendars. But for now, may your dreams be calm and mercifully unwatched. And if the church cast a long shadow over the households of medieval Europe, then its calendar, the sacred rhythm of fasts, feasts, and restricted days, cast an even longer one. Because once the church had declared closeness acceptable only within marriage and for the purpose of creating life, it didn't stop there. It went further, shaping a moral landscape where timing was everything. Even married couples bound by vows and blessed by priests found themselves navigating a complex schedule of spiritual guidelines. The medieval couple didn't just need affection, they needed a liturgical planner. Let's begin with the days of the week. Sundays? Certainly not. That was the Lord's Day, a time for worship, reflection, and rest. Sharing a moment for personal comfort was seen as a distraction from sacred focus. Fridays? No again. A day of penance and remembrance. Wednesdays? Unclear. But tradition marked midweek as spiritually delicate and best approached with caution. Now add in the feast days of saints scattered across the calendar like devotional milestones. Each saint and holy event came with its own customs and reverence. Then came the liturgical seasons, Lent, a 40-day period of fasting and contemplation. Advent, the quiet lead up to Christmas. During these times, personal connection wasn't just discouraged, it was viewed as spiritually inappropriate, which meant that for a devout medieval couple, the year quickly filled up with limits. Some confession manuals and religious writings estimated that nearly half the calendar was considered unsuitable for moments of marital closeness. That's roughly 180 days, guided not by one's feelings, but by spiritual observance. It turned time itself into a delicate path. Want to enjoy a peaceful evening with your spouse? Check the date. Then check again, because if it was Lent, a feast day, or even just a Friday, the concern wasn't only personal, it was eternal. The reasoning behind these guidelines lay in the church's theology. Physical pleasure, even within marriage, could draw attention away from spiritual growth. The body was seen as a vessel worthy, but needing guidance. To act outside of designated times, even with good intentions, could risk imbalance. Even lawful actions had to align with sacred timing. Tenderness, however quiet or heartfelt, was still subject to the calendar of heaven. And these teachings weren't just abstract. Many believed that closeness during restricted periods could lead to consequences. Children conceived during Lent were thought by some to be at risk, physically, spiritually, or otherwise. Certain texts warned that disregarding the calendar could bring misfortune, shame, or sermons that, while indirect, felt very personal. In a world where neighbors noticed everything, discretion was not just polite, it was protective. This created a strange emotional landscape within marriage. Couples had to balance love with duty, warmth with worry. Even simple acts of affection might feel risky. Some spouses distanced themselves during sacred seasons, not only physically, but emotionally, fearing that comfort could become a temptation. Marriage became not only a bond, but a quiet negotiation between the heart and the heavens. The church offered guidance of a kind. Manuals existed to help couples navigate the spiritual schedule. One 12th century text calculated appropriate days based not on feelings, but on which feast occurred, when whether fasting had ended, and whether the moon was in a favorable phase. Yes, even lunar cycles were considered. Some believed certain phases carried greater risks tied to tides, old lore, and temptation. This blend of Christian theology and folk belief created a complex framework, especially for couples who depended on their local priest to help them make sense of it all. But rules don't always rule. Many peasants, especially in distant villages, far from strict supervision, lived according to the rhythms of the earth, not the altar. They followed the harvest, the seasons, and the sleep cycles of their children. Some may have known the expectations and gently set them aside. Others perhaps never heard them at all. The church could guide behavior, but the fields and the haylofts had their own sense of timing. Nobles, however, faced tighter oversight. Their households were close to both power and influence. Chaplains lived within their walls. Confessors recorded their struggles, and their actions carried wider consequences. A nobleman who acted out of step might face public correction or loss of standing. A noblewoman, especially one whose future child affected inheritance, was watched more closely still. The results weren't just personal, they were political. So how did couples respond? Some developed quiet cues: a candle in a window, a folded cloth, a hand rested gently on a shoulder. Others turned to confession, not always for forgiveness, but for clarity or hope. Some priests were more compassionate than others. Many understood. And if a child came from such a moment, some simply accepted it as a sign of grace. Perhaps it had always been meant to be. Still, the anxiety remained. Historical records show that some of the most common spiritual concerns brought to confession weren't about dishonesty or violence, but about shared moments on the wrong day. Couples felt torn, not because they lacked love, but because they feared they had loved at the wrong time. A kind of spiritual uncertainty became part of marriage itself, and yet people carried on. They adapted. They found humor in the challenge. Some poems joke about calendar marriages where devotion to saints outweighed devotion to spouses. There are letters asking for one more night before a holy season began. Stories tell of long walks taken not to enjoy the evening, but to create distance. Some couples even practice gentle separation during sacred times, sleeping apart, not from anger, but from reverence. But change was on the horizon. In the later Middle Ages, as reform movements stirred and literature found its way into the hands of everyday people, new ideas began to circulate. Some writers gently questioned whether sincere affection truly needed such strict timing. Others proposed a more compassionate view, one where shared warmth was not a weakness, but a reflection of grace. By the 15th century, doctrine remained largely unchanged, but practice had begun to shift. The calendar was still marked, the teachings still known, but couples were interpreting. Clergy were advising with more nuance, and love, as it always does, was finding its way quietly, thoughtfully, persistently, because no matter how many days the church declared off limits, the heart steadily and sincerely kept its own time. So, as you settle into sleep tonight, picture a quiet room, a flickering candle, and two people sitting together, but not too close. They've checked the date. They've said their prayers, and still their hands gently meet. Because love, like time, always finds a way. Sleep well, dear listener. Next time we'll visit the confessional itself, a quiet booth where the questions were whispered, but the rules were louder than ever. And if the calendar made love a matter of scheduling, then the confessional made it a matter of inquiry. Because in medieval Europe, privacy didn't end at the door. It extended quietly, uncomfortably, into the dark wooden box of the confessional. It echoed in whispered concerns, in shifting knees on stone floors, in the silence between question and answer. And no matter how personal your connection, the church always had one more thing to ask. Confession in the Middle Ages wasn't optional, it was essential. For the devout, it was a regular ritual, a way of cleansing the soul and realigning the heart. But unlike modern confession, which often focuses on general intentions, medieval confession was detailed, sometimes surprisingly so, especially when it came to the rhythms of married life. Priests weren't just spiritual guides, they were moral observers, trained to seek understanding from even the most hesitant penitent. Manuals instructed them how to speak not just to those who had strayed publicly, but to spouses too, especially to spouses, because being married didn't mean that everything was automatically virtuous. In fact, it came with its own set of concerns: poor timing, misdirected intention, and imbalanced sentiment. And it was the priest's role to help clarify those gray areas. The questions were not vague, they were strikingly precise. Did you approach your spouse with affection, guided by care, or by self-interest? Did you spend time together on a day of spiritual observance? Did you experience more emotional warmth than required for your shared purpose? Did you act in ways not traditionally endorsed? Did you delay completion for personal enjoyment? Did you express too much interest in the moment? Did you look at each other in a way that stirred excessive desire? Yes. These were real questions, not satire, but actual entries in confession guides carefully compiled by religious leaders who believed that spiritual balance required examining even what society often left unsaid. Some priests followed these instructions closely, while others adapted based on the needs of the moment. But for many, especially those earnestly trying to live well, the confessional became a place of uncertainty. They entered hoping for clarity and sometimes left with new concerns. And yet confession wasn't meant as punishment. It was also a form of spiritual honesty, one shaped by the church. In a world where people rarely spoke openly about their feelings, the confessional became a space where words could be said, perhaps for the first time, perhaps never again. But it wasn't equal. The priest asked. You answered. The priest evaluated. You listened. He remained quiet and unseen, while you knelt in full openness, offering not only actions, but thoughts, hesitations, and hopes. Everything you were taught to contain you now had to speak. For some, this created a complex bond with their confessor. He became not just a religious leader, but a witness to their inner lives, a quiet participant in their efforts to do right. Some returned weekly, others at every major holiday or after moments of closeness just in case. And the questions extended beyond deeds. They explored the heart. Have you regarded your spouse with overwhelming longing? Have you imagined another? Have you thought too long about a kind gesture or a shared smile? Feelings mattered. Reflection was encouraged. But attachment, if unchecked, could become a concern. One guideline even asked priests to consider whether a couple had gone beyond the boundaries of reserved affection. But what were those boundaries? The texts didn't always agree. Some said a quick kiss was fine. Others allowed brief closeness, but discouraged lingering. Some said warmth was acceptable, but only in silence, and preferably without too much cheer. Yes, even laughter could raise eyebrows, because joy left untempered might awaken something unsteady, and the church, for all its comfort, was cautious with the unpredictable. And yet the more the rules tried to shape the heart, the more the confessional, filled with voices, quiet, honest, and deeply human voices, trying to live faithfully in lives that didn't always follow plans. Of husbands who wondered if expressing fondness too often was wrong. Of wives who felt uncertainty about being cared for deeply. Of couples who shared gentle bonds and still wondered whether they'd crossed invisible lines. Sometimes, manuals reminded priests to offer reassurance that care was not a mistake, but that too much focus on it could lead to distraction. But how much was too much? That no one could say with certainty. And here's the strange truth. In towns across Europe, some priests knew more about their parishioners' households than their birthdays. They weren't just guides. They became quiet keepers of personal stories, watchers of generations of everyday kindness caught in layers of belief. Many held that role with empathy and humility, others did not. Stories remain of those who became too inquisitive, who used the booth not for healing, but for control. The confessional, while sacred, was also a space of influence where power came in questions and silence often carried the most weight. Still, people came. They spoke. They searched for peace. Because behind the hesitation, there was hope for grace, understanding, and release. In a world of hardship, sickness, and fear, people held tight to the idea that honesty could bring comfort, even if the subject was delicate. Later reforms softened many of these traditions. Confession became quieter, more private. The tone shifted, but the memory remained the belief that our hearts needed to explain themselves, that our feelings required permission, that even love in its safest forms must be weighed. And so, the confessional endured a wooden space where closeness was examined, where kindness spoke in hushed tones, and where stillness sometimes echoed louder than words. So as you drift off tonight, imagine not the stone walls of judgment, but the warm hush of candlelight and the quiet strength of two people choosing care in a world of rules. The grace it takes to be gentle with yourself. Close your eyes. The questions are done. The answers are your own. And tonight, there's nothing left but peace. Sleep well, dear listener. And if confession revealed the tension between love and doctrine, then marriage exposed the even deeper tension between love and duty. Because for all the sermons, for all the questions whispered behind wooden panels, there was still the quiet, unpredictable, deeply human matter of the heart. The longing to love and to be loved, not just dutifully, not just appropriately, but sincerely. But in medieval Europe, love and marriage were rarely allowed to meet. Marriage, you see, wasn't a personal choice. It was an arrangement, a family matter, a social tool. If you were a noble, marriage was a move across political lines. If you were a peasant, it was an agreement for survival. If you were a merchant, it was an investment. The language of romance came later, long after the dowry was discussed. The land was measured, and the priest gave his blessing. Children didn't choose their spouses. Their families did. And not just parents, sometimes uncles, local lords, religious leaders, or kings. A father could pledge his daughter's future when she was still a child. A noble boy might be promised to someone he'd never met. And once agreed, through land, coin, livestock, or alliance, it was as solid as law. There were exceptions, of course. Some couples found warmth ahead of arrangement. Some families allowed affection to grow first. But more often, love came later, if at all. And if it didn't, that was considered part of life. The church, interestingly, held a somewhat bold view, at least on paper. Church law taught that consent made a marriage valid. Not wealth, not ceremony, not even the couple's shared life. If two people truly and freely said, "I do," the union was real, even without family approval. This sometimes challenged the interests of powerful families who arranged matches for influence. Two people could marry in secret and still be considered wed in the eyes of the church. But here's the challenge. That same church also emphasized obedience to parents. That marriage should carry family approval. That public ritual mattered. So while love-based consent was honored in theory and practice, it was rare and often discouraged. A young woman who eloped might be cast out. A young man might lose his inheritance. Love might win in spirit, but lose in life. So most followed the path chosen for them. Noble marriages were formal occasions arranged well in advance. The couple might meet at a feast exchange, gifts perhaps share a brief conversation, and then be bound together sometimes before adulthood. The union was built not on feeling, but on land status and alliance. Hope lingered that affection might grow like moss on stone. Sometimes it did, sometimes not. Peasant marriages were simpler, yet still practical. A young woman's value might be measured in her skills or resources, a young man's in his animals or harvest. If affection blossomed, it was welcome, but it wasn't expected. Marriage was a structure, a means to share labor, raise families, and prepare for winter. Still, love found its way in. It appeared in stolen glances at the market, in dances under festival lights, in songs sung by shepherds or traveling musicians. Poems about noble longing gave voice to feelings too delicate for open discussion. Troubadours sang of yearning secrecy and hope. These weren't instruction manuals. They were safe spaces for imagination. And for some, those stories mirrored their lives. Letters remain real ones from medieval individuals who chose feeling over tradition. A nun wrote soulfully to a former companion. A scribe left his position to marry a widow against his family's plans. A village girl waited 7 years for the return of her promised partner. Love noticed presence, not permission. It valued kindness, not contracts. Yet even within arranged marriages, not all was without light. Some couples united by duty found understanding, shared laughter, a quiet partnership that grew like unexpected blossoms. Records tell of spouses who prayed together, worked side by side, tended to one another in illness, who chose to face each other at night long after the fire faded. They didn't write ballads, they wrote lives. Still others struggled, especially women. A girl married young, before she could decide for herself. A widow paired with someone she didn't trust. A noblewoman offered in alliance after alliance before reaching maturity. Marriage offered structure, but also restriction. Ending a marriage was difficult. Annulments required strict conditions. Harm was rarely addressed. If a woman was mistreated, her recourse was often limited to prayer patience or the mercy of others. Yet even then, the idea of love held on. Even the church in its most cautious moments recognized that shared affection was meaningful. That joy between spouses, if balanced, reflected a deeper union. Some thinkers even wrote that love in marriage could enrich the soul so long as it stayed within respectful bounds, so long as the heart remained anchored in intention rather than desire. In time, this conflict between planned duty and emotional hope gave birth to stories, songs, and quiet changes. Eventually, across generations, the ideal of marrying for love emerged from dream to possibility to principle. But in the Middle Ages, it was a small, careful light, shielded from wind, guarded from judgment, yet still warm. So tonight, as you rest, think not just of castles and agreements, but of quiet, enduring tenderness, of a boy carving a symbol into bark, of a girl softly humming a tune she never forgot, of two people, once strangers, who found warmth not in storybooks, but in shared bread and quiet evenings. Because even in a world where love was not promised, it still arrived. And it remained. Sleep well, dear listener. Next time, we'll explore a more unsettling chapter the myths and truths surrounding the so-called chastity belt, and what it truly reveals about control belief and the balance between protection and power. And if marriage was meant to bring security, then few symbols reflected its quiet anxieties more than the legendary chastity belt. You've likely seen the image maybe in a museum, a film, or a cartoon. A rigid metal device shaped like clothing, with locks and keyholes, and a sense of control. Said to be worn by medieval women while their husbands went to war, it was believed to be a method of ensuring loyalty by placing physical barriers around trust. But here's the truth. That image, that story, it's mostly myth. Not entirely, but largely. Because while the chastity belt remains one of the most memorable symbols of medieval control, it reveals more about modern imagination than about medieval life. Like most legends, it holds a thread of truth tangled in misunderstanding, exaggeration, and a measure of projection. Let's unravel it. First, very few belts of this kind from the Middle Ages survive, and most that do, they were made in the 19th century. Yes, the 1800s, the same era that gave us railroads, gaslight, and intense discussions about morality. Many medieval belts displayed in museums today were crafted centuries after the fact, often as novelty items, satire, or commentary. Some had medical uses. Others were theatrical props. A few were even made for collectors, less about history, more about curiosity. And the earliest written references, they don't appear in laws or church records. They appear in jokes. Yes, sarcastic songs, satirical poems and plays from the 14th and 15th centuries, where the belt was shown as absurd or ironic. The anxious knight, the jealous husband, the clever wife with a second key. These weren't instructions. They were commentaries, winks, not warnings. Still, the story found an audience because the idea spoke to a larger reality, not about metal belts, but about trust and the fear of losing it. In a world where women were often seen as the keepers of family honor, their choices were monitored closely. A father's respectability was tied to a daughter's reputation. A nobleman's legacy depended on his wife's integrity. A royal heir had to be unquestionably legitimate. So while the object may have been fictional, the concern behind it was deeply real. Some men, driven by these worries, imposed various forms of control, not only physical separation, but social pressure, constant supervision, and cultural expectations. Occasionally, stories or sketches described belts with locks, but these were often symbolic, not clothing but cautionary tales, illustrations, not reality. And practically speaking, these belts weren't designed for daily life. The surviving examples from later eras are rigid, uncomfortable, and unwearable for long periods. No one could move naturally or even stay healthy while wearing one not without harm. The idea, logistically, simply doesn't hold up. Yet, freedom was still limited. Even without metal, women lived within unspoken boundaries, traditions, teachings, community judgment. A young girl was reminded that her choices mattered. A wife was taught that quietness was virtue, expression was risky. Disobedience, intentional or not, could cost her everything. Some daughters were placed in convents to protect their future. Some wives were assigned companions who monitored their movements. Some laws restricted how women could dress or speak. These weren't physical locks, but they held just the same. And expectations weren't equal. A man's mistake might be overlooked, but a woman's misstep, real or assumed, could follow her for life. Many learned to move carefully, to think ahead, to navigate spaces not built for them. Their decisions often belonged to others, to fathers, husbands, mentors, sometimes even to kings. And yet, they lived. They shared stories. They offered kindness. They carved space. A noblewoman once hid verses between pages of her prayer book words about independence. A merchant's wife sent heartfelt letters to a friend, confiding her hopes. A seamstress stitched small symbols into her clothing, silent personal reminders of who she was. These were not the women in chains. These were the ones who loosened them. And perhaps that's why the chastity belt myth lasts, not because it happened often, but because it captures a timeless tension between caution and freedom, between what's expected and what's true, between the image we're given and the story we want to write. Even today, the symbol echoes, not in steel, but in ideas, in how stories are told, in quiet assumptions, in rules spoken and unspoken about how someone should live, in judgments that linger longer than they should. But if this old myth still lives, so does something brighter, because for every tale of restriction, there is another quieter about choice, about strength, about someone who stepped beyond what was expected and into something truly theirs, someone who moved gently through the world but never let it define them. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, let go of the old image. Let go of the locks. Let go of the fear that kept so many silent. Instead, picture a girl walking barefoot through a garden. The gate is open. The evening breeze is soft. She hums to herself. She's been told to stay quiet, but she sings anyway. Sleep well, dear listener. And next time, we'll follow her beyond the garden toward the quiet freedoms medieval women created, despite every wall built to hold them back. And if chastity was praised in songs and sermons, then the brothel was where the unspoken truths of desire played out just beyond the church bells. Because medieval Europe was full of contradictions, the church taught restraint, society demanded obedience, but behind closed doors, or more often behind city walls, there existed spaces where sex was not only sold, but regulated, taxed, and strangely enough tolerated. Yes, tolerated. Not celebrated, not approved, but allowed. Because no matter how many rules were preached from pulpits, people had needs. And in a world without privacy, without birth control, without many choices for women, brothels became both a solution and a symptom, a bandage over the deeper wound of human loneliness and power imbalance. Let's begin with how the medieval world treated prostitution. In many cities, especially growing urban centers like Paris, London, Florence, and Cologne, prostitution was legal. Not only legal, but managed by the state or local authorities. Brothels were licensed, inspected, and expected to follow a set of rules. Why? Because church leaders, city magistrates, and moralists all understood one uneasy truth. If you outlawed sex work, it didn't disappear. It just went underground. And that they feared would be worse. So instead, they tried to contain it like a controlled fire. St. Augustine, writing centuries earlier, had said something that echoed through the Middle Ages: remove prostitutes from human affairs, and you will unsettle everything with lust. In other words, better a public sin than a secret chaos. So cities built brothels often near rivers' markets or just outside town gates. These were not glamorous places. They were often crowded, poorly lit, and harsh. But they were also protected, at least to a degree. In exchange for working, their women received a kind of rough security. They wouldn't be arrested, beaten by guards, or chased out of town. But that safety came with rules. And those rules, they were many. Women in brothels had to register. They had to live in designated areas. They were not allowed to wear the same clothes as respectable women. Many had to wear distinctive colors, often yellow or belts, badges or veils that marked their profession. They couldn't attend church at the same time as others. They couldn't marry freely, and they couldn't leave without permission. Some cities even enforced curfews. A woman could work at night, but had to stay indoors during holy days. Others taxed brothels, heavily using the money to fund hospitals, bridges, or, ironically, church repairs. It was a strange system, part morality, part economy, part hypocrisy. And what about the women themselves? Some were there by choice, or what passed for choice. Orphaned girls, poor widows, abandoned wives. For them, the brothel offered shelter, food, and a strange sort of independence. They earned wages. They controlled their bodies at least more than they could in a forced marriage. But many others were coerced, trafficked, or born into it. Some were sold by desperate families. Some tricked by false promises of servant work. Others inherited the profession from mothers who had no other options. Consent in such a system was murky. And then there were the brothel keepers, sometimes women, sometimes former sex workers, sometimes nuns. Yes, there were cases where retired nuns ran moral brothels to prevent worse sins elsewhere. Sometimes the church itself owned the land. In Avignon, the seat of the papacy in the 14th century, brothels paid rent to church officials. That's not fiction. That's a receipt. And then there were the clients, men of all kinds, students, merchants, soldiers, monks, priests, even kings. Brothels became a kind of open secret places where power was briefly undone or abused, where confessions were forgotten, where names weren't spoken, where judgment paused. And yet behind all that was something deeper. Pain. Because even in the best regulated brothel, the work was hard, the hours long, the danger constant, disease rampant. There was no real medical care, no birth control, and little protection from violence. Many women died young. Others faded into poverty when they aged out. Few left by choice. Fewer still found love. But some carved out lives. They saved money, bought small homes, protected younger girls. Some even became community figures, midwives, herbalists, matchmakers. Their knowledge, though unofficial, often surpassed the doctors and priests. And yet, they were never invited to speak. In medieval art, prostitutes were painted with downcast eyes. In literature, they were scorned or pitied. In sermons, they were warnings. Rarely were they shown as they were tired, clever, wounded, strong. And what of redemption? Some did leave. Through marriage, through the church, through sheer will. A few cities had Magdalene houses, shelters, for fallen women to repent and live quietly. But even there the road was narrow. Repentance had to be total. Identity erased. A second chance meant starting from nothing. Still, their stories linger. In a ledger from Venice, a woman named Caterina signed her name in bold ink, paying off her debts and walking away from the brothel forever. In London, a woman named Alice sued her former keeper for abuse and won. In Florence, records show one woman leaving behind a small fortune to her daughter and her daughter's daughter. These weren't saints or sinners. They were survivors. And tonight, as you close your eyes, imagine one of them. not in shadow, not in shame, but sitting by candlelight, counting coins, hard-earned, whispering a lullaby to a girl who will never have to make the same choices. Sleep well, dear listener. Next time, we'll visit a different kind of bed, one in a monastery or abbey, and discover what happened behind cloistered walls where chastity was sworn, but never simple. And if the brothel was a space where desire was commodified, then the monastery was its mirror, where desire was supposed to disappear entirely. Supposed to. Because behind cloistered walls, beneath white veils and black habits, beyond chance and candlelight, there beat human hearts, restless, yearning, imperfect, just like yours. In theory, a monastery was a sanctuary from the world, a place where men and women left behind temptation, flesh, and worldly love in pursuit of something higher. Nuns were called brides of Christ. Monks were soldiers of virtue. And every bell that tolled was meant to signal a triumph over sin. But of course, the body doesn't disappear just because you pretend it should. For many, entering a convent or abbey wasn't a matter of spiritual calling, it was arrangement. Younger daughters with no dowry, sons not set to inherit land, families that wanted prestige or peace, or one less mouth to feed. Some were cloistered as children long before they understood what it meant to take vows. And once inside, the world didn't vanish. It just changed shape. Monasteries were not empty stone halls. They were communities, busy, intimate, and deeply human. There were gardens to tend, kitchens to run, books to copy, rooms to share. There was laughter, gossip, fatigue, boredom. And with all of that came attraction. It didn't take much. A shared glance during morning prayers, the brush of fingers passing a chalice, a dream that lingered into dawn, a confession that became too honest. And yet, the official rule was clear celibacy, complete, unquestionable, eternal. For monks and nuns alike, any act of sexual expression alone or with another was a sin, not just a mistake, a betrayal of vows, a rupture between self and God. Even thoughts were suspect. Desires had to be cast out. Longings silenced with prayer, fasting, and penance. But rules, as always, are easier written than followed. In private journals and church trial records, we glimpse the reality beneath the rule. A nun who slipped out to meet a priest in the orchard. A monk who wrote love poems in the margins of his psalter. A pair of novices who were caught embracing behind the altar. Stories that end in scandal or silence. And yet some relationships endured for years. In England, in the 14th century, a nun named Joan of Leeds faked her death to escape the convent and live with her lover. In Germany, 2 nuns were found to have shared not only a bed, but a secret language of symbols and locked boxes. In France, a monk and a nun corresponded in coded letters for decades, hidden beneath layers of theology. Were these the majority? No. But neither were they rare. Even the church knew this. That's why rules existed, not to prevent desire entirely, but to punish those who acted on it. Monasteries had internal courts. Punishments ranged from fasting to flogging to excommunication. Repeat offenders might be transferred or locked away in stricter cloisters. And yet, desire remained. Because isolation breeds longing. Imagine it years in the same rooms with the same people. No family, no spouse, no privacy. Only prayer and silence, and the echo of your own heartbeat. It's no wonder some found solace in each other, and not all intimacy was physical. Sometimes it was emotional, a shared secret, a whispered confession, a gentle hand in the infirmary, a letter folded and hidden in the hem of a robe. Monastic love, when it happened, was quiet, careful, and often unspoken, but not always. In some places, nuns wrote poetry, complex, vivid verses about longing for God that sounded suspiciously like longing for someone else. Were they metaphors, sublimations, or simply honesty disguised as devotion? And then, of course, there were the scandals. Some abbeys became infamous, not for piety, but for indulgence. Reports of orgies, secret births, even underground tunnels linking nunneries and monasteries. Were all of these true? Likely not. But the fact that people believed them says something about the tension between image and reality. And what of punishment? Often the woman suffered more. If a nun became pregnant, she was removed, sometimes imprisoned, sometimes left to starve. Her lover, if he was a priest or monk, might be reassigned or quietly forgiven. The baby, if born, was often taken to foundling homes raised without names. And yet, some resisted. There are rare but powerful records of nuns refusing to repent, of monks who left their orders to live openly with the ones they loved, of abbesses who protected their sisters from shame and exile. Love, even forbidden love, found small pockets of grace. It would be easy to judge, to call them weak, hypocritical, unfaithful. But maybe they were simply human, because to be human is to long, to reach, to stumble. And maybe in a stone cell lit by morning sun, a monk knelt not in guilt, but in gratitude, because for one moment he had felt truly seen, truly touched, truly alive, and maybe just maybe God understood. So tonight, as you fall asleep, picture not punishment, but mercy, not fire and brimstone, but warmth. The quiet kind, the kind that comes from a candle left burning for someone who might return. Sleep well, dear listener. Next time, we'll step outside again into the marketplaces and town squares where scandal, flirtation, and gossip traveled faster than sermons, and where love somehow survived the noise. And if monasteries whispered of hidden desires, then the open world whispered of something else, the quiet, desperate hope not to conceive. Because while medieval society praised marriage, praised fertility, praised the growing of families like good wheat in spring, not everyone always wanted another mouth to feed or another body to bear. But in a time before science, before reliable knowledge of biology ovulation, or even germs avoiding pregnancy, was a strange dance of folklore, faith, and fear. And oh, what a dance it was! Let's begin with the most surprising part. People did try to avoid pregnancy in the Middle Ages, often, quietly, desperately. It wasn't always allowed. The church strongly opposed it, at least in writing. Official doctrine said sex was for procreation, and anything that interfered with that natural purpose was sinful. Condoms, sinful. Withdrawal, sinful. Herbal drinks, doubly sinful. But doctrine and daily life are rarely the same, because while theologians debated, midwives whispered. While priests thundered from pulpits, women traded recipes in the garden. And while husbands counted blessings, wives counted days. So how did medieval people try not to get pregnant? Let's start with herbs. Pennyroyal, rue, Queen Anne's lace, mugwort, savin. These weren't just weeds. They were potent, risky, and often used in secret, brewed into teas, ground into powders, soaked in wine. Some were believed to prevent conception. Others, more dangerously, were used to bring on delayed menstruation, which was often code for ending an early pregnancy. Did they work sometimes? But the line between a helpful dose and a deadly one was thin. Then there were the more creative methods. Beaver testicles. Yes, you heard right. Some texts advised women to carry dried beaver testicles around their necks to ward off pregnancy. Others recommended drinking wine boiled with crushed animal parts, sparrow brains, goose intestines, or dried worms. Why? Because symbolism was powerful. If something seemed virile or strange, maybe it could confuse the womb. Still, not strange enough. Try amulets. Worn between the breasts or tied at the thigh, these were charms made of herbs, stones, bones, and sometimes written prayers. Some were shaped like wombs. Others had inscriptions in Latin, Greek, or nonsense syllables meant to sound mystical. Many included references to saints or ancient goddesses. They weren't just contraception. They were protection from fate, from shame, from the divine. Some women also relied on timing, observing their cycles, counting days, avoiding sex during fertile periods. It wasn't exact, but it was something. A quiet science passed from mother to daughter. And yes, there were condoms, not latex, not reliable, but they existed, made from linen animal intestines or fish bladders soaked in vinegar or wine, worn more to protect from disease than to prevent pregnancy, but still some hoped they helped. There was also coitus interruptus, withdrawal before climax. The church condemned it, but many couples practiced it anyway, trusting instinct more than dogma and whispering to no one. But what if all else failed? Then came the remedies for after. Again, herbs, baths, vigorous jumping. Some women were told to sneeze while lying upside down. Others used pessaries, small objects inserted into the body soaked in oils or vinegar. Some were shaped like beeswax cones. Others were sponges tied with string. These methods were dangerous. Infection was common. So was injury. But desperation is a strong motivator, especially when the alternative was a child you could not feed, or a scandal you could not hide. And yet through it all, women talked, not publicly, but quietly, over fences, in kitchens, during laundry. Midwives were the keepers of this lore. So were healers, herb wives, and wise women, some later branded as witches, not because they cursed, but because they knew. They knew how the body worked, or at least how to coax it. And sometimes, even the clergy looked the other way, not because they approved, but because they understood. A priest might preach chastity, but he also heard confessions. And confessions told the truth. People are human, and humans hope, and fear, and try against all odds to control what cannot be controlled. And then there's the mystery of silphium, an herb from ancient times famed for its power to prevent pregnancy. The Romans prized it so dearly, they printed it on coins, but by the Middle Ages, it was gone. Extinct, harvested to death. Still whispers of its power lingered in texts, and some claimed it grew still somewhere in the East, a lost miracle, a symbol of what women had once known, and maybe mourned. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, imagine not potions or punishments, but a woman in a quiet garden. She knows which leaves to pick, which moon to trust, which friend to ask. Her knowledge is old, fragile, unrecorded, but real. And she uses it not for rebellion, but for survival. Because in a world that demanded so much of her body, she found a way, however imperfect, to reclaim just a little piece of it. Sleep well, dear listener. And next time, we'll wander into the realm of folk magic and fertility charms, the blurred line between medicine and superstition, and the secret rituals that shaped medieval love and fear alike. And if birth control was whispered through herbs and hidden recipes, then love-longing, impossible, dangerous love often reached for something stranger magic. Because in medieval Europe, when logic failed and prayers grew quiet, many turned to charms, potions, spells, and small pieces of the inexplicable. Not because they didn't believe in God, but because sometimes they needed something closer, more personal, more desperate. Let's begin with the basics. A love charm might be as simple as a knotted ribbon buried under a threshold, or a phrase whispered 3 times beneath a full moon. Or it might be elaborate, a candle carved with initials lit with a lock of hair, while the lover recited lines from a book older than memory. The goal, desire, fidelity, passion, or at the very least, attention. Medieval grimoires, manuals of folk magic, are filled with such rituals. Want someone to fall in love with you? Write their name in your blood on parchment, fold it into dried rose petals, and hide it beneath their pillow. Want to break a rival's hold? Drop a salted frog's tongue in their drinking cup. Want to forget someone burn their token at twilight facing east? It all sounds strange now. But in a world where most marriages were arranged and women had little say, and romance was more risk than promise, these rituals offered a kind of fragile power, a chance to hope, to act, even if it was only symbolic. Some charms used body parts, hair, fingernails, sweat, or even menstrual blood. One recipe advised adding a drop of blood to a lover's wine for eternal devotion. Risky, yes. Forbidden, absolutely. But believed without question. There were also amulets worn close to the skin, hidden beneath tunics, or stitched into sleeves. Carved from bone, inscribed with stars, soaked in rose oil, or wrapped in threads of red and gold. They weren't just decorations. They were promises, and the ingredients, unusual often, ashes of doves, powdered pearls, mistletoe picked on Midsummer's Eve, the dust of a church bell, the whisper of a name written backward. Magic wasn't precise. It was personal, a blend of nature and belief, of desperation and imagination. And then came the love potions, usually made by healers' midwives or old women on the edge of town. Sometimes herbal, sometimes alcoholic, often laced with aphrodisiacs like Damiana anise cinnamon or even crushed beetles. They were brewed in secret, consumed with hope, and blamed when hearts broke. But love magic wasn't always soft. Some spells were meant to bind, to keep a lover faithful, whether they wanted to stay or not. Others were curses cast by jealous rivals or scorned women. Stories tell of men who suddenly went impotent, or women who dreamed the same name every night until madness crept in. The church condemned it all. Magic, especially in matters of the flesh, was heresy, a challenge to God's will, a temptation of the devil. But still, it flourished, quietly, in the shadows, in kitchens, in sighs, in the pages of books hidden under mattresses, because love, real or imagined, refused to be tamed. And the people who used these charms, they weren't witches in towers or sorcerers in dark robes. They were ordinary, a lonely wife, a worried girl, a boy afraid his crush would marry another, a mother desperate to keep her daughter safe, a widow hoping to feel warmth again. Love, after all, is the most human magic of all, and sometimes the spells worked, or seemed to, and that was enough, because belief is a spell in itself. So tonight, as you close your eyes, picture a woman kneeling by a hearth. She holds a small satchel cloth, worn thin, tied with string. Inside a scrap of a name, a pressed violet, a tiny shell. She kisses it once, just once, and slips it under her pillow. Does it work? Maybe not. But in that moment, brief, soft, sacred, she feels something like hope. And that, too, is a kind of enchantment. Sleep well, dear listener. Next time, we'll look at how society punished and judged these private acts of love and magic through public shame, scarlet letters, and the painful rituals of confession. And if love spells offered a whisper of hope, then the confessional was where that whisper came to die. Because in medieval Europe, no passion, no matter how fleeting or gentle, went entirely unobserved. And when you crossed a line, even a secret one, you were expected to repent, publicly, painfully, penitently. It started with shame, not the quiet kind that creeps into your chest in the dark, but the kind sewn onto your clothes. In some towns, adulterers were made to walk barefoot through the streets, wearing nothing but a linen shirt marked with red or yellow symbols. Some carried candles, others ropes around their necks. Sometimes the crowd threw mud, sometimes worse. They called it penance, but really it was punishment as spectacle. Then came the confession. For Catholics, the sacrament of confession was the soul's laundry. Sins once spoken aloud could be absolved by a priest if the sinner was truly sorry and if they accepted a penance. But for sins of the flesh, the path to forgiveness could be steep. Sleeping with someone outside of marriage. Penance might be a year of fasting or walking a pilgrimage barefoot, touching yourself. Weeks of bread and water, breaking a vow of celibacy, perhaps a lifetime of silence and isolation, even expulsion from religious life. The De Penitentiis, a medieval guidebook for confessors, listed punishments by sin, like a grim menu. For a kiss stolen during Lent, 7 days fasting. For lying with a married woman, 3 years no communion. For spilling seed unlawfully, 10 days bread and water. It wasn't just about morality. It was about control. The church believed that regulating desire was part of regulating society. Unchecked lust, they feared, would erode not just families, but souls. And so priests became gatekeepers of bodies as much as spirits. But not all confessions were equal. Men, especially powerful ones, were often treated more gently. A nobleman might pay gold and recite a few prayers. A peasant girl, caught with her lover, she might face public whipping or worse, be shunned from her village. And if a woman confessed to more than just passion, say to using herbs or charms or midwives to fix a missed cycle, her confession could become a trial. And trials had witnesses, and witnesses had pitchforks. Sometimes these cases escalated beyond church courts into secular punishment. In parts of Europe, women accused of adultery were paraded through town with shaved heads. In Italy, some were forced to ride backwards on donkeys through the market. In England, stocks and pillories humiliated fornicators. Public shame was seen as correction, as warning, as moral theater. And what about same-sex desire? It was punished harshly, often in silence, whispers, expulsion, inquisition, burning even. But more often, it was erased, written out of confessions, ignored in records, buried in ruins of letters never sent. Still, people confessed because guilt is heavy. But sometimes, confession wasn't just about guilt. It was a kind of relief, a release. In the quiet dark of a chapel behind a wooden screen, a voice would tremble. I touched her hand too long. I dreamed of him again. I kissed her during the Easter bells, and the priest would listen and decide what price love should pay. But here's the secret. Not all priests were harsh. Some had loved too. Some wept after hearing. Some gave soft penance. Some whispered blessings cloaked in silence. Because even those trained to judge knew desire doesn't vanish with sermons. And love, real aching, imperfect love, was never meant to live in chains. So, tonight, as you fall asleep, imagine not the pillory or the shame, but a dim chapel, a single candle, a heartbeat behind a carved screen, two voices, one confessing, one listening, and somewhere between them, forgiveness. Sleep well, dear listener. Next time, we'll explore how love and sexuality were depicted in medieval art and literature, from illuminated manuscripts to bawdy poems hidden in margins, and what they tell us about the hearts behind the history. If peasants whispered of herbs and hope, then the nobility whispered of something else, virginity. Not desire, not love, but proof. In medieval aristocracy, a woman's body wasn't just her own. It was a contract, a vault, a political promise sealed not in words, but in the presence or absence of blood. Let's begin with the belief itself. Virginity in medieval thought wasn't just a state. It was a virtue, a moral badge, a symbol of purity handed from father to husband. It represented not only chastity, but obedient self-control and a kind of mythic, untouched innocence. It was sacred, idealized, and most dangerously, it was expected, especially if you were noble. Because in noble households, marriage was strategy. Unions were forged to strengthen alliances, claim land, unite kingdoms, prevent war. And for these arrangements to hold, one thing had to be certain, that the children born from the union carried only the husband's bloodline. Thus the obsession with a bride's chastity. A virgin bride meant a legitimate heir, a secure inheritance, a father's honor intact, a mother's duty fulfilled, and behind it all, an entire family's reputation, future, and fortune. So how was it proven? Let's talk about the wedding night ritual. In many noble households, the consummation of the marriage wasn't just private, it was witnessed, not in full of course, but often trusted attendants stood outside the chamber door. Some traditions required a priest to bless the bed. Others had noblewomen inspect the bridal linens afterward. A blood-stained sheet carefully displayed the next morning was held up as proof of the bride's honor. No blood. Then the whispering began. She was no maiden. His lineage is in danger. Her family tricked us. It didn't matter that not all women bleed. Biology bowed to belief, and belief bowed to reputation. In some places, the stained sheet was paraded through the streets. In others, it was kept as legal evidence. The more powerful the families, the more pressure to perform purity. And what if the bride failed this test? Then came shame, whispers, cold silences, in rare but brutal cases, annulment. Some women were sent home in disgrace, others forced to undergo physical examinations by midwives to confirm whether the hymen was still intact. These procedures were not medical, they were rituals of suspicion. But here's the contradiction. While a noblewoman was judged by her virginity, a nobleman was judged by his conquests. Boys were encouraged to gain experience before marriage. Older lovers, brothel visits, even affairs with married women, it was expected, celebrated even, because it showed virility, strength, masculinity. But a woman, one touch, even before marriage, could ruin her. A double standard carved in stone. Some women found ways to resist. They trained themselves to bleed with herbs, or secretly pricked their fingers to stain the sheets. They bribed midwives, wove stories of divine visions or misunderstood afflictions. Others married quickly, before rumors caught up. A few embraced the scandal widows who refused to remarry women who turned to convents or lovers outside the law. And yet some still believed in the symbol, the story, the sacredness, and perhaps for a few, their wedding night was truly the first. A soft trembling moment between two strangers who would become partners, then friends, then the parents of kingdoms. But even then, eyes waited outside the door. So, tonight, as you fall asleep, imagine not the shame or spectacle, but the silence between two people, a girl heart pounding, a boy just as afraid, the creak of a bed, the weight of generations watching through candlelight, and still, maybe a gentle hand, maybe a soft voice, maybe something like kindness in a world that demanded proof before love. Sleep well, dear listener. Next time, we'll visit the medieval courts of love, where poetry, flirtation, and the art of longing were celebrated as games of honor, beauty, and broken hearts. If virginity was a contract, then adultery was a breach, not just of affection, not just of trust, but of order. In medieval Europe, marriage was rarely a matter of love. It was property, lineage, alliance, and once sealed, it came with expectations, especially for women. And when those expectations were broken, the consequences were swift and rarely fair. Let's begin with the word itself, adultery. In Latin, adulterium, to alter, to corrupt, to introduce something foreign. And that's exactly how the act was viewed, as a contamination of the household, the bloodline, the social fabric itself. And so the punishments were severe, for women especially. In many parts of Europe, a woman caught in adultery faced public shaming. In France, she might be shaved bald and paraded through the village in only her shift. In England, she could be banished or forced to walk barefoot, holding a candle through the town square. In Germany, some towns had Ketzelhut, a pointed hat of shame for adulteresses. And in Italy, women were made to ride backwards on donkeys while the crowd jeered. Men, they were punished too, sometimes. But often, a man's adultery was seen as less damaging, especially if his affair was with a lower-class woman or a prostitute. As long as he didn't disrupt property or scandalize the community, he could get away with it. A quiet confession, a donation to the church, a whispered apology. The double standard was embedded in law. In many regions, a husband could kill his wife and her lover if he caught them in the act and walk free. But a wife, if she killed her unfaithful husband, she faced death herself. And what of the children? If a woman bore a child from an affair, the child could be denied inheritance, called a bastard, marked for life, sometimes taken away, sometimes killed. That's why noble households obsessed over chastity, why bedsheets were inspected, why servants were spies. Because one mistake could unravel a dynasty. But adultery wasn't always discovered. And so came the quiet systems of surveillance, maids who watched doorways, midwives who examined bellies, neighbors who gossiped, priests who listened too closely during confession. Women learned to speak carefully, to disguise letters, to hide meetings in markets or shrines, to send gifts through servants, to burn what must never be read. And sometimes, love still grew, even under threat of ruin. There were stories of knights and noblewomen who risked it all, of poets who turned their sin into songs, of queens who had children by their lovers and dared the world to deny it. But most often, adultery meant fear, not freedom, not romance, just the gnawing dread of discovery, because reputation was everything. A woman labeled unchaste could lose her dowry, her children, her name. She might be sent to a convent, or locked away, or forced to stand in the church porch in sackcloth, begging forgiveness from the community. Men, too, could suffer if the affair crossed the wrong lines, if it involved another man's wife, if it disrupted politics, if it made enemies in court. Then even powerful lords could fall. But beneath it all, adultery remained human. A look held too long, a letter sent too late, a touch that couldn't be undone. And in that, there's something tender, tragic, real. Because even in a world obsessed with honor, people still reached for love, or at least for warmth. So tonight, as you drift to sleep, imagine not the crowd's shout or the judge's hammer, but a quiet room, a candle burning low, two hands brushing beneath a carved table, a heart racing not just with desire, but with danger, because sometimes what's forbidden is not what we hate, but what we most long for. Sleep well, dear listener. Next time, we'll step into the courtly world of amour courtois, where adultery was not a sin, but a poetic ritual, and love was played like a game, with rules players and no promises of mercy. You might think that love in the Middle Ages was only about arranged marriage's duty or strict rules, but behind all the political alliances, the carefully managed unions, and the rigid expectations, there existed something else, something more poetic and complex, the world of courtly love. This wasn't modern love. It wasn't casual flirtation either. It was a ritual of refined emotion, where longing was cherished, but fulfillment was forbidden. And that contradiction, that was the point. Courtly love wasn't the affection between husbands and wives. It was the admiration between those who couldn't be together. A knight pledging his devotion to a noblewoman, a poet praising someone already married. The connection was expressed through poetry chivalry and symbolic gestures, not physical closeness. This tradition, called fin amour, began in the royal courts of southern France and spread across Europe, becoming both a literary movement and a cultural ideal. Imagine being a knight. You rode into battle not just for glory, but while wearing your lady's ribbon as a token. You composed verses in her honor. You proved your character through restraint, loving without expectation. It sounds beautiful, and it was, but it was also fragile. Courtly love celebrated intense emotions, but only under strict rules. A letter too bold, a gesture too open, could invite gossip or worse punishment. For noble women, the risks were greater. A lady might have a devoted knight who admired her from afar, but she was expected to remain distant, composed, untouchable. One misstep, and she could face judgment. Yet still, many longed to be seen, to be cherished. So this love became a kind of performance. Every glance, every pause, Every poem was carefully crafted. Symbols replaced words. A drop glove could mean everything. A song could say what mouths could not. And through this love became an art. We know about this world thanks to troubadours, traveling poets who turned admiration into verse. They celebrated emotional depth, loyalty, and noble suffering. But this wasn't a game for everyone. Courtly love was a privilege of the elite. For many, it was admired from a distance. For a few, it was lived with both joy and heartbreak, and like all traditions, it had its shadows. Some used poetry to manipulate. Others treated admiration as a trophy. Not all stories ended in grace. Some ended in scandal, some in silence, but some endured. And even today, echoes remain in the idea that true love means patience, that beauty lies in the unsaid, that longing can be a kind of devotion. So tonight, as you close your eyes, picture a candlelit hall, a soft melody playing, a woman's glance catching yours, brief, gentle, meaningful. You say nothing, but in that silence, something lingers, something tender, something timeless. Sleep well, dear listener. Next time, we'll explore how love and longing appeared in medieval art and literature, from gilded manuscripts to hidden verses, and what they reveal about the human heart behind the history. Conclusion. Despite many barriers, people still found love. In the maze of laws, honor class, and judgmental eyes, people in the Middle Ages still found a way to love. Whether it bloomed in silence and poetry, in a lingering glance, or in the words of a wistful song they let their hearts feel. Not because they were fearless, but because love, even when forbidden, always found a gap to grow. Maybe that love was never complete. Maybe it remained a dream never touched. But within that longing, that restraint, that quiet admiration, love became deeper, and people more human. And perhaps among all the rules written by power, religion, and tradition, love was the one thing people secretly kept for themselves. So if you've ever loved someone but couldn't say it aloud, if you've ever just watched them go heart full of words you never spoke, then you too have known a moment of courtly love. And tonight, may you fall asleep, gently wrapped in the softness of that memory. You didn't plan on becoming a philosopher. You planned on becoming wealthy, or rather staying wealthy, because you were born into it. Cypress sun, purple robes, ships full of dye sailing out under your family's name. That is until the shipwreck, not metaphorically. A real shipwreck, somewhere between Phoenicia and Athens, your entire fortune sank into the sea. With it all your plans, all your comfort, all your certainty. You arrived in Athens with nothing but seawater in your sandals and questions in your chest. What now? You wander. You listen. You end up in a bookstore because even ancient people browsed when they were lost. And there someone's reading aloud, a story of a man who drinks poison calmly, who chooses death with dignity, who speaks of virtue as if it's something you can wear like armor. You ask the bookseller, "Who is this man?" "Socrates," he says, "a philosopher." And just like that, not instantly, but irreversibly, you're pulled in. You want to know how someone can be calm in the face of ruin, how they can lose everything and still not be broken. You find crates. A philosopher who wears rags, owns nothing, and laughs like the world can't touch him. He becomes your teacher, not through lectures, but through how he lives, through how he walks with nothing yet seems to lack nothing. And you begin again. You start asking questions that don't make money, but make meaning. You stop chasing comfort and start studying control, not of others, but of yourself. Your reactions, your thoughts, your attachments. That's how you, Zeno of Citium, become the founder of Stoicism. Not through temples, not through politics, but through loss, through falling, through realizing that when the ship sinks, what survives is who you are underneath. And that's where our story begins tonight, with a man who lost everything, only to discover the one thing that couldn't be taken. Now close your eyes. We're about to walk with Zeno through marble streets and silent thoughts, past riches lost, into wisdom found. You don't remember when exactly you started walking behind crates. Maybe it was the day he flung a coin into the crowd, just to watch people scramble for it, then laughed and said, "See how little it's worth." Or maybe it was the day he told you that your fine clothes were like a cage for your soul, that you'd never feel free until you stopped trying to impress people who didn't even know you. You wanted to argue. You had pride, education, a past full of silks and coin, but something in you was tired, tired of losing sleep over lost fortunes, tired of needing things to feel like someone. So you stayed. You walked beside the man who owned nothing and yet seemed invulnerable. Crates didn't give you lectures. He gave you space. Space to sit in silence, to think, to unlearn. He showed you how freedom wasn't about having, but about needing less. He challenged you in strange ways, once offering you a rotting fish to carry through the agora, just to see if shame still had its claws in you. It did. You flushed red. People stared. You hated it, but you did it. Because you were beginning to see philosophy wasn't meant for ivory towers or scrolls in gilded halls. It was meant for the street, for the marketplace, for people like you who had lost everything and didn't want to lose themselves next. In time, you studied with others, Stilpo, Xenocrates, Polemo. Each one left fingerprints on your thinking. But it was Crates who broke you open. And then one day, you were ready. Not to be a teacher. Not yet. But to speak. To stand in front of others and ask, what if strength doesn't mean control over the world, but control over how we respond to it? What if virtue is the only thing we truly own? You didn't rent a building or start a school. You went to the painted stoa, a long shaded colonnade on the edge of the agora, a place where people came to stroll, to think, to speak. Its columns were covered in murals, epic scenes of battles and triumphs, heroes and myths. It was public, honest, open, just like your philosophy. So you stood beneath the painted ceilings, and you began to talk. You didn't sell answers. You asked better questions. You didn't promise peace. You taught how to practice it every day in small acts, in how you rise, how you eat, how you wait in line, how you lose. You told people they didn't need to fear misfortune, because it was never the event that crushed them, but how they interpreted it. And people listened. They didn't sit in desks. They leaned against pillars or listened as they passed by. Fishermen, merchants, widows, students, people who didn't care about theoretical metaphysics, but did care about how to get through the day without breaking. You gave them tools, not riddles. Discipline, courage, justice, wisdom, not as lofty ideals, but as choices you could practice in the dirt of everyday life. And so Stoicism was born, not in marble halls, but in the breeze of a painted walkway. Not in dusty scrolls, but in lived experience. Not as a religion, but as a way to stay whole in a world that keeps breaking. You never claimed to be perfect. Sometimes you got angry. Sometimes fear crept in. But you learned to observe it like a visitor knocking at your door. You didn't let it take over the house. You reminded your listeners, we suffer more in imagination than in reality. That everything outside of our minds, fame, wealth, even death, is not good or bad on its own. Only our response makes it so. And you practiced what you preached. You walked slowly, ate simply, refused gifts. You wore modest clothes and taught under open sky. You lived the idea that happiness isn't pleasure, but alignment with virtue. And others came after you. Cleanthes, Chrysippus, Epictetus. They added refined, expanded. But it was you, Zeno of Citium, who stood first beneath the paintings and said, let us not chase what we cannot control. Let us master ourselves instead. And perhaps that's why, even now, thousands of years later, people still whisper your words in quiet moments when they lose something, when they're afraid, when they need to remember who they are beneath all the noise. You never sought to be famous. You only wanted to be free. And in seeking that, you gave us a map. Sleep well, listener. Next time, we'll walk further with the Stoics. Perhaps into the mind of Epictetus, the slave who became a sage. Or maybe into Marcus Aurelius's chamber, where an emperor whispered wisdom into a worn journal by candlelight. Wherever we go, remember this: you don't have to control the world, just the part of you that meets it each day. And that is enough. You meet Cleanthes the same way most people meet their limits, by lifting something heavy. Before he was a philosopher, Cleanthes lifted weights and delivered water. Literally, a boxer by training, a laborer by trade, a thinker by quiet necessity. You probably wouldn't have noticed him at first. He didn't speak much. He showed up at the painted stoa, covered in sweat hands, calloused from pulling water jars across town all night, just so he could sit quietly and listen to Zeno in the morning. Other students had tutors, scrolls, soft sandals. Cleanthes had stamina. He earned enough by carrying water to afford only one thing: his place beneath the columns. People mocked him. They called him a mule, asked how a man who barely spoke could learn philosophy, told him his muscles were too loud to make room for thought. But Cleanthes, he just kept walking, kept pulling, kept listening, because he had something no mockery could touch: discipline. And maybe that's what Zeno saw in him. Not the words, but the weight, the quiet way he endured. The kind of student who didn't just understand philosophy, he became it. Eventually, Cleanthes became Zeno's successor, not because he was the most eloquent, but because he was the most steadfast. While others quoted verses, Cleanthes lived them. He taught that you didn't need to speak beautifully, you needed to live rightly. That truth wasn't in clever phrases, but in how you carry your burdens when no one applauds. And carry he did. He didn't stop working even after he became a philosopher. He believed that labor wasn't beneath wisdom, it was its test. He said that a man who cannot endure sweat cannot endure himself. But Cleanthes wasn't all grit and silence. One night, perhaps, when the city was quiet and the stars seemed closer than the rooftops, he wrote something that surprised even those closest to him. A poem. Not just any poem. A hymn. To Zeus. Not the thunder-throwing god of myths, but a symbol of reason, order, and divine law. His hymn to Zeus wasn't about worshiping a bearded deity in the sky. It was about honoring the rational structure of the universe, the great logos that binds everything together, the Stoic God, not made of flesh and flame, but of reason itself. He wrote, "Most glorious of immortals, Zeus, from thee proceeds the race of mortal men. All that on earth creeps, moves, or flies owe their existence to thee." Cleanthes wasn't praising a personal god. He was acknowledging that everything flows from one rational source, and that even pain, if rightly understood, has purpose. He saw the storms of life not as chaos, but as part of a greater design. He believed that if we could live in harmony with that design, we could find peace even in hardship. That poem, Hymn to Zeus, became a cornerstone of Stoic spirituality, not because of its rhyme, but because of its resilience. It reminded people that even if the world looks broken, it is never truly disorderly. That every moment, good or bad, is an opportunity to cooperate with nature. And in that cooperation, there is peace. Cleanthes taught this not just in verse, but in life. He lived simply, ate humbly. When offered wealth, he turned it down. When offered comfort, he chose labor, not because he hated ease, but because he trusted difficulty more. He once said that you must be tempered like steel heated, hammered, and cooled before you become strong. And maybe that's what Stoicism was for him. Not a retreat from life's burdens, but a way to lift them with grace. He taught that if you can't change what's outside you, you can still shape your response. That virtue is like a muscle grown through effort, strengthened through use. You imagine him now in the quiet morning of Athens, filling jars, hauling water, then standing beneath the painted stoa, listening to a younger student stumble over a question about desire or duty. And Cleanthes, not scolding, just smiling, waiting, lifting the weight of silence so the student could grow stronger in the answering. He didn't just hand down philosophy, he passed down how to carry it. And long after he was gone, that strength remained in his students, in the verses, in the slow, steady echo of footsteps across the marble floors of the Stoa. Because what Cleanthes taught us is this: you don't need to be brilliant. You don't need to be eloquent. You just need to show up every day with intention, with honesty, with care. And if you do, even your silence becomes philosophy. Sleep well, dear listener. And next time, we'll meet Chrysippus, the man who codified Stoicism, debated until dawn, and once laughed himself to death. Yes, really, but that's for another night. Tonight, carry Cleanthes with you, the water bearer, the hymn writer, the philosopher who taught us that the heaviest loads sometimes build the lightest hearts. You've heard of him in passing, a name said in half reverence, half awe, not because he was charming, not because he was gentle, but because he was relentless. Chrysippus of Soli. If Zeno founded Stoicism and Cleanthes nurtured it, then Chrysippus built it from the ground up, stone by stone, argument by argument, until it could stand unshaken. But you wouldn't recognize him on the street. No robes of gold, no aura of mystery, just a lean man with sharp eyes and a sharper mind. Often muttering under his breath, scribbling logic on scraps, and legend says writing over 700 books, not because he wanted fame, but because he couldn't stop thinking. He once said, "Give me a syllogism, and I'll give you the world." And he meant it. You see, Chrysippus believed philosophy should be airtight, not vague, not poetic, not something to be felt. He wanted Stoicism to survive not just because it inspired, but because it made sense. So he took Zeno's moral insights, Cleanthea's hymns, and laid over them a framework of logic, physics, ethics, and psychology so precise it could rival the structure of a temple. He became the engineer of Stoicism. But don't let that intimidate you, because Chrysippus wasn't trying to make Stoicism cold. He was trying to make it last. He knew that ideas, no matter how beautiful, fade unless they're built on foundations that can hold weight. So he got to work. First, logic. Chrysippus took the messy questions of the human mind, how we think, why we believe, how we argue, and turned them into a system. He refined propositional logic, not just Socrates is a man, but if Socrates is a man, and all men are mortal, then he didn't just teach people what to think. He taught them how to catch themselves thinking badly. To him, logic was a sword, not for winning debates, but for cutting through illusion. Then physics. No, not the kind with equations and falling apples. Stoic physics meant understanding nature itself, what exists, what causes what, and how it all fits together. Chrysippus said that everything is material, even the soul, even thought. He described the cosmos as a single living being, divine, rational, and ordered. And inside that cosmos, you a spark of reason, trying to live in tune with the whole. Everything happens according to logos, universal reason, even misfortune, even death. So, your job isn't to fight the universe, but to understand it and align with it. Finally, ethics. To Chrysippus, ethics was where it all came home. The point of logic was to think clearly. The point of physics was to see your place in the grand order. But the point of ethics was to ask, now that I understand, how shall I live? And the answer always was in accordance with nature. Not just trees and rivers' nature, but your own nature as a rational being capable of choice, courage, compassion, discipline. Virtue to Chrysippus wasn't a costume. It was your core. He taught that emotions like fear, envy, or grief weren't inevitable. They were judgments. And if they were judgments, they could be examined, challenged, replaced. So you sit with that. The idea that maybe your anger isn't a fire but a thought. That maybe your sadness isn't bottomless, but a belief. And beliefs can change. It's empowering. And a little terrifying. Chrysippus knew that too. He didn't expect you to transform overnight. He expected you to train like an athlete of the soul. He said, as long as you live, keep learning how to live. That's Stoicism at its root. Not cold detachment, but a lifelong refinement of your inner life so that nothing outside you can control the inside. He wasn't always beloved for it. He debated endlessly, even with friends. He could be sarcastic, pedantic, exhausting. But even his rivals admitted without Chrysippus Stoicism would have died. He gave it structure, and from that structure, centuries of strength would grow, reaching all the way to Seneca, in Rome, Epictetus, in exile, Marcus Aurelius on his imperial bed. But tonight, it's just you. And the quiet hum of a mind remembering that thought is not your enemy. That logic is not your cage. That the more you understand what you can control, the more peaceful your life becomes. You're not here to memorize syllogisms. You're here to be reminded that clarity is kindness. That structure can be comfort. That even the most restless mind, given the right framework, can rest. So, tonight, let Chrysippus watch over your sleep. The relentless mind, the stubborn architect. The man who taught us that strength doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be logical. Sleep well, dear listener. Next time, we'll sit with Epictetus, the philosopher born into slavery who taught freedom of the mind with nothing but a wooden leg and an iron will. But until then, trust your thoughts, train your soul, and rest like a philosopher. You weren't born into hardship. In fact, you had almost everything: a Roman villa, tutors, wealth, power on the horizon. Your name is Lucius Annius Seneca, and you grow up surrounded by scrolls and servants, the son of a well-known orator, raised in Cordoba, and then educated in Rome. You learn fast, speak well, rise quickly, but you also grow sick. Your lungs betray you. Coughs echo in the colonnades at night, and sometimes you lie awake wondering if you'll see the next morning. It makes you think maybe more than other boys your age. About time, about pain, about what really matters. You begin to study philosophy. And somewhere in your fevered nights and political ambitions, Stoicism finds you. But your version of Stoicism, it won't come easy. Because while others like Cleanthes chose simplicity from the start, you're in the heart of Roman politics. You're climbing ladders, wearing togas, dining with emperors, and that's where the friction begins. You want virtue, but you also want influence. You preach about detachment, but you're accumulating villas. You write about death and courage, yet you serve under Nero, a man whose cruelty turns even senators pale. At one point, you are his tutor, then his advisor, then his prisoner. And it's not that you're a hypocrite, it's that you're human, caught between your ideals and your reality. You teach Stoicism not as a saint, but as someone trying, failing, and trying again. You write letters to Lucilius, hundreds of them filled with wisdom, sharpened by contradiction. You remind him, and maybe yourself, we suffer more often in imagination than in reality. Wealth is the slave of a wise man, the master of a fool. He who fears death will never do anything worthy of a living man. And then you get up. You go to the Senate. You navigate plots, whispers, knives in the dark. You don't flee from life. You stay inside the storm, trying to build peace in the middle of thunder. That's what makes your Stoicism different. You don't teach it from a mountain. You teach it from a palace, from the fire. And over time, the dissonance wears you down. You ask to retire. Nero lets you reluctantly. You withdraw. You write more, reflect more. But peace doesn't last. You're eventually accused of conspiracy, told to take your own life. And in one final act of Stoicism, you do. Not because you wanted to die, but because you believed in dying with dignity. They say you opened your veins in the bath, surrounded by friends, speaking calmly as your blood thinned into the warm water. Not with panic, but with practice. You had rehearsed this moment in your mind many times, because to a Stoic death is not the enemy fear is, and though you weren't perfect, you met your end the way a Stoic should aware. Composed, aligned with your values. And so tonight, as you drift to sleep, perhaps your struggle feels familiar. You want to be good, but you also want comfort. You want to let go, but you also want recognition. Seneca would understand. He didn't demand purity. He offered permission to wrestle, to try, to fail, and to grow from that failure. That's the Stoicism he gave us. Not the kind that scolds from a pedestal, but the kind that walks beside you in a world full of noise and temptation and gently whispers, you can still return to yourself, even now. Sleep well, listener. Next time we'll visit Epictetus, born into slavery, yet more free than most emperors. But tonight, carry Seneca's tension with you. not as a weight, but as a reminder. You don't have to be flawless. You just have to keep walking toward what matters, even when the path isn't straight. You don't own yourself, not your name, not your clothes, not even your time. You were born into slavery, and yet you are the freest man in the empire. Your name is Epictetus. You don't remember your mother's voice, only the walls of the Roman household that owned you, only the sound of commands shouted, not asked, only the quiet you learned to keep because silence could save you, and pain. Yes, you know it. A twisted leg likely broken by a cruel master. You walk with a limp forever, but you never curse it. You learn early there are two kinds of chains, one made of iron and one made of thoughts. And you decide you can't control the first, but you will master the second. Somehow, against all odds, you are allowed to study. You listen to the lectures of Musonius Rufus, a Roman Stoic who teaches not from scrolls, but from the bruises of life. You listen more than you speak. You watch the world carefully. You notice how people suffer twice, once from what happens, and again from how they interpret it. And you realize freedom isn't the absence of chains, it's the ability to choose your response. That's the moment Stoicism stops being an idea. It becomes a way to breathe. Eventually, you are freed, not by revolution, but by age, perhaps luck, perhaps favor. Still, you carry your limp, your past, and your insight. You don't seek wealth. You don't run for Senate. You open a school in a small corner of Nicopolis, far from the center of Rome. No fanfare, no fame, just a room, a teacher, a few curious minds, and you begin to speak. You say things no emperor would dare say aloud. You are disturbed not by events, but by your beliefs about them. No man is free who is not master of himself. It is not things that upset us, but our judgments about things. You teach that the only true possession we have is our will, not our body, not our job, but the space between what happens and what we choose to do next. That space. You protect it like sacred ground. You teach your students how to train it, sharpen it, and never give it away. Even when insulted, even when robbed, even when loved. Because love, too, you say, must not be based on control, but on freedom. You don't demand asceticism. You don't demand indifference. You teach clarity, simplicity, and a kind of invincibility that has nothing to do with armor. Your school grows. Your words spread. Even the emperor, Marcus Aurelius, later copies your phrases into his journal, finding in your voice a kind of compass. But you remain humble. You write nothing yourself. Your student Arian takes notes so meticulous, so faithful, that your voice survives through his pen. And so we hear you today, softly across centuries. Don't demand that things happen as you wish, but wish for them to happen as they do, and your life will go smoothly. Even in old age, you walk slowly to your bench. You speak gently, not as one who preaches, but as one who knows what it's like to be powerless and still have power. You remind your students that storms will come, people will betray, health will fail, fortune will turn its back, but the soul that has trained itself to accept, reflect, and choose wisely, that soul cannot be conquered. You stop chasing what you can't hold, and in those small, quiet moments, you live the revival. Tonight, as you drift off, let Marcus write beside your bed. Let Epictetus whisper through the noise. Let Seneca smile quietly at your ordinary attempts to be better. And remember, the Stoics aren't history, they're habits, not relics, but rituals, not ancient, but eternal. Sleep well. And tomorrow, when the world shouts, you'll return to your center, to your inner citadel, to the part of you they can't disturb, and you'll begin again, like they did, like we all must. You wake up. Before your feet touch the ground, your screen lights up. Emails, news, messages, notifications. Your attention pulled in 10 directions, none of them inward. But somewhere in the noise, you remember you have a choice. You silence the phone. You sit still for a moment, and you return to what the Stoics have always taught, not in marble halls, but here on a weekday morning, before coffee, before chaos. You ask yourself, what is within my control today? Can I respond to this with clarity? Will I be ruled by emotion, or will I rule myself? In a world addicted to reaction, you practice restraint. When someone cuts you off in traffic, you breathe. When your post doesn't get enough likes, you remind yourself your worth was never in pixels. When you're tempted to scroll, scroll, scroll. You ask, is this leading me closer to peace or pulling me away? That's Stoicism today. It's not quotes on a coffee mug. It's not a Bauer motivation post. It's how you choose to live in the pause between stimulus and response. It's how you remind yourself, my emotions are real, but they are not facts. This is hard, but not impossible. I can endure. I have before. You might not wear a toga. You might not walk a Roman forum, but you do face judgment, pressure, uncertainty. And like Marcus, you return to your journal. Like Epictetus, you question your assumptions. Like Seneca, you simplify what matters. You don't need a temple, just a moment. You don't need exile, just intention. Even now, in this digital age of distraction and disconnection, you can choose Stoicism. Not because it's fashionable, but because it's functional. A philosophy built not on theory, but on practice. So as the world speeds up, you slow down. As others chase more, you ask what's enough. As chaos swirls, you stand still. And in that stillness, you find your center. Sleep well. And tomorrow, when the noise returns, remember, you are not your inbox, not your status, not your follower count. You are what you choose. You are what you repeat. You are what you value in silence. The Stoics knew this. Now, so do you. You're not feeling well. Not in the I've got a cold kind of way, but in the deep, unnameable way. A strange ache in your stomach. A rash that spreads without reason. Nightmares that visit again and again, leaving you tired before the day begins. You live in a small village 2,000 years ago. There are no hospitals, no doctors, no science to explain away what you feel. Only whispers, stories, and one place you think of the temple of the healing God. You dress, simply carry some oil, a bit of honey, and a coin not to pay for treatment, but to offer to the divine. Because in your world, sickness isn't just a physical imbalance, it's a spiritual message. A sign that something in the universe is out of tune. Maybe you've angered the gods, or forgotten to honor what's sacred. You walk to the temple of Asclepius, the god of healing. Their people don't get prescriptions, they get dreams. It's called incubation, a sacred sleep in the temple where the spirit of Asclepius is said to appear and heal you in your dreams. You lie on stone floors, surrounded by towering columns. The air smells of incense. Somewhere a sacred snake glides across the stones, a symbol of rebirth and transformation. You close your eyes, and you believe. In the morning, a priest asks, "What did you dream?" And you tell him. Every image, every detail. If Asclepius touched your wound in the dream, they say you're healed. If not, they offer incense, say a prayer, and you sleep again. No tests, no bills, just ritual and trust. You begin to understand. Healing isn't about fixing a machine. It's about listening to the soul. Today you might laugh at this. You might call it superstition or unscientific. But if you've ever been helpless in a hospital, if you've ever begged for healing that medicine couldn't give, have you not whispered to some invisible force? Have you not longed for a God with kind hands? Modern medicine cuts symptoms. But the old healers, they asked, is the patient lonely? Is their spirit crying? What part of their belief has been lost? And sometimes, that's the real first treatment. Tonight you may not lie in a marble temple, but you can close your eyes and gently ask, what part of me needs healing? What can I forgive today? What can I let go of just enough to sleep? Because maybe healing begins not with a pill, but with a pause. And maybe the body follows where the soul begins. You sit before an elderly man. No coat, no magnifying glass. He doesn't tap your knee with a rubber mallet or send you for an ultrasound. Instead, he's silent. His eyes watch you as if you were watching a river, not just the water, but what's flowing inside. He asks you a few questions, not to record them, but to hear the voice in your answers. You live in an ancient world where diagnosis comes not from machines, but from observation feeling, and sometimes whispers of the gods. You hold out your wrist. He places 3 fingers on your pulse, gently, almost lovingly. This is where he listens to how the river inside you flows. Is it fast or slow? Regular or irregular? Is there cold, hot air? Is something stuck in the middle? No numbers appear, only intuition and the art of feeling. In ancient Egyptian, Indian, or Chinese medicine, the pulse is the mirror of the universe in the body. It tells the doctor not only about the liver, heart, lungs, but also your mood worries and what you are hiding. But that is not the only tool. The doctor also looks at your face, your skin, tone, your eyes, your breathing. If you are pale, it could be wind. If you are hot, it is an imbalance between yin and yang, or it could be an angry spirit. They also listen to your voice. If you speak slowly, deeply, it could be a cold liver. If you speak quickly with a sharp voice, it could be a fire burning inside. Your whole body is a map, but that map does not only record physics, but is a reflection of heaven, earth, human. Some healers will use fire mirrors or water to diagnose illnesses. Sometimes they leave your urine in the sun for 3 days. If it changes color, it means there is a demon. Sometimes they burn wax on your photo. If the image burns off, it means you are cursed. For them, the body does not function separately from the universe. Your pain may be due to a planet out of alignment or an ancestor who has not yet passed on. Once you go to see a medium, she doesn't ask many questions. She just lights incense, takes a cup of water, and mumbles, "Someone is following you." A spirit that has not been properly worshipped. You shiver, not because you believe her 100%, but because she is touching on a fear that modern medicine never names. And you realize Diagnosis in ancient times was not about identifying the name of the disease, but about understanding what was wrong. The wrong between you and your environment, between you and your ancestors, between you and yourself. Today, when the doctor reads the test results, you know you have a problem with your stomach. But 2,000 years ago, people would say, your stomach is holding things that you cannot digest with your soul. You are holding an unspoken anger in your stomach. No one can say who is right and who is wrong. But perhaps what is worth thinking about is we have been listened to with silence. Do you remember the last time a doctor looked at you for 10 seconds without taking his eyes off you? Do you remember a time when you were asked, "What are you angry about? Are you having recurring dreams? Do you feel like you are living your life to the fullest?" Ancient doctors did not only treat the body, they touched the soul that no one else could touch. Tonight, before you go to sleep, if you feel something is not healing, try not to look for an answer right away. Instead, observe yourself like an ancient physician. Where am I sad? What part of me is lacking light? Is my rhythm out of sync with the flow of the universe? Because sometimes the first thing to do to heal is not to act, but to pay attention to yourself, like a teacher looking at the pulse of the world. You've just been diagnosed. No printed prescriptions, no insurance codes. Instead, you're handed a small cloth pouch. Inside, a few dried leaves, a glimmering stone, and a red string. Herbs for cleansing, a stone for protection, and the string to bind away evil. You're not surprised. You live in a world where nature is your pharmacy and magic is part of the medicine. Herbs, the root of medicine and belief. Long before the word pharmacist existed, people were picking leaves, digging roots, boiling water. You remember the first time your mother placed mint leaves on your forehead during a fever. It cooled more than your skin. It reached into a fire deeper inside you. Your ancestors believed each plant had a spirit. And if gathered properly, at the right moon phase, with clean hands and a whispered prayer, the plant would agree to help. And so began the folk medicine cabinet garlic to ward off evil, mugwort for cramps and pain, dandelion root for cleansing the liver, chamomile to calm the dream-plagued, willow bark, the great-grandmother of aspirin to cool fever when fire spirits invaded the body. But herbs alone weren't enough. Healers would mix them with ritual. Roots boiled in sacred spring water, leaves sprinkled with salt, placed under a pillow with the words, "Take the sorrow from this body. Return peace to this heart." You weren't just drinking tea, you were drinking belief. Minerals, stones that protect ancient healers saw power in earth itself, especially in stones. You'd wear amber to keep sickness away. Sleep with agate under your pillow to avoid nightmares, or tie turquoise around your neck to guard against bad winds and misfortune. No one thought these stones had chemical properties. They believed each one was a sleeping spirit waiting to be awakened. And so you wore them not as decoration, but as armor, magic charms, protection from the unseen. Do you remember the little charm pouch your mother once tied to your shirt? You asked, "What's this?" She smiled and said, "Just a few words and a wish for you to be safe." Charms weren't medicine, but they made space for healing to enter. You might carry a folded paper inscribed with the name of a healing god, tied 3 times with red thread, tucked under your pillow, hung on the door, or worn inside your shirt like a whispered reminder. You are not alone. You are protected. Some charms called on gods. Some pushed away evil. Some simply held someone's love. Healing as connection to body, earth, and spirit. You begin to realize nothing in that pouch kills bacteria. There's no clinical study backing the red thread. And yet you start to breathe easier, not because your illness vanishes instantly, but because you no longer face it alone. You start listening to your body. You talk to plants. You believe each sip of herbal tea not only soothes your throat, but washes away something you couldn't quite name. And maybe, just maybe, when you believe in the possibility of healing, that's when healing begins. Before you sleep tonight, you don't need a charm under your pillow tonight, but you can still close your eyes and whisper, "Body, thank you for trying. Let the herbs within me calm what aches. Let belief soothe what has no name yet." There's nothing superstitious about speaking kindly to the part of you that hurts. Because sometimes, the most powerful medicine doesn't come from a bottle. It comes from a hand held in yours, and a soft voice that believes you'll be okay. You didn't expect a knife, not in a time when prayers were whispered more often than bones were cut, not in a world ruled by gods and floods where illness was often seen as a punishment or test. But this is Egypt, nearly 1,600 years before Christ. And the man before you isn't just a healer. He is a scribe of wounds, a scribe of the body, chronicling every injury like it were a message from the stars. He doesn't wear white, no gloves, no anesthesia. But he knows how to open a body without harming the soul. You lie down on a linen sheet, no sedative, only a prayer to Thoth, the god of wisdom and healing, to guide his hands and to keep you conscious. He lifts a bronze blade, soft yet sharp, kissed by the fire of artisans. And when he begins, he doesn't guess. You're now part of the pages of a scroll, the Edwin Smith Papyrus. It's not a spell book. It's not mysticism. It's the first surgical manual in human history. And in it, written in firm, measured hands, if the wound on the forehead penetrates to the skull and the pulse becomes irregular, the patient shall not survive. Or, if the collarbone is fractured but the lung remains intact, bind the limb firmly. In 10 days, healing is expected. Every entry diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment isn't superstition. It's ancient science drawn from decades of observation and battlefield necessity. You feel the blade glide across your skin. It's not just pain, it's opening. Like a door creaking in the wind. Like the desert air touching something sacred inside you. The healer doesn't panic. He has seen war wounds, crocodile bites, falls from chariots, but he moves slowly, carefully, as if each stitch is a line in a sacred text carved into the walls of Karnak. There is no blood spray, no chaos, just a quiet focus. Honey, wine, and linen, the holy trinity of aftercare. There are no antibiotics here, no antiseptic sprays. Instead, the wound is washed with fermented wine, covered in honey, known even then for its antiseptic power, wrapped in clean linen that's been sun-dried by the Nile itself. You're not in a sterile room. You're in the hands of nature's sun salt sweetness. You exhale, not because the pain is gone, but because the fear of being touched, of being broken, has softened. And slowly, you understand, surgery in this world is not a brutal act. It's an act of deep knowledge, of trust, of precision without modern tools. To open a body is to believe that what's inside can be healed. Tonight, as you lie in bed and press your hand gently to your chest, imagine turning the final page of an ancient papyrus, one that reads, "If the patient still answers when their name is called, they still wish to live." And you no matter. The wound can still answer. You are not ill, at least not in the way men define it. Your belly is heavy. Your body shifts like sand beneath the Nile. You've missed a moon. Your breath shortens when you climb stairs. Your dreams are stranger, so you visit a healer, not just any healer, but a female priestess physician trained in the art of life itself. She doesn't ask how many days you've been sick. She asks how many moons since your last bleeding. She looks at your eyes, feels your pulse, places a hand over your womb, and nods, not because she knows all, but because she has read the scrolls. And one of those scrolls is the Kahun Papyrus, the oldest medical text on women's health in the world, a scroll of fertility diagnosis and divine rhythm, written around 1800 BCE. The Kahun Papyrus isn't filled with prayers. It's filled with observations, treatments, and structured assessments of the female body. Each line begins the same way. Examination of a woman who cannot conceive, a woman whose menstruation is irregular, a woman with pelvic pain, a woman whose breasts ache after birth. These aren't secrets whispered in corners. These are entries in a medical record written in ink on papyrus by women who knew women. The papyrus details how to test for fertility using garlic or onions placed in the vagina overnight. If the woman's breath smells of garlic the next day, her reproductive tract is considered open. It may sound strange now, but in a world without ultrasounds or lab results, the body spoke in the only language it could, through signs, smells, sensations. Treatments from Garden Temple and Moonlight. Your healer brews a mix of crushed dates, acacia bark, and honey. This paste may be used as a contraceptive, lining the womb with a barrier soft and sacred. If you suffer from cramps, she wraps your lower abdomen with warmed linen soaked in chamomile. If your milk dries after birth, she offers fenugreek and a whispered prayer to Hathor, goddess of motherhood. Her medicine bag is not just physical. It holds rituals, chants moon cycles, and memory. She may tie a small charm to your wrist shaped like a frog symbol of birth. She may hum a melody that her grandmother hummed when she too was in labor by the river. Pregnancy prophecy and the sacred unknown. Some women come not with pain, but with questions. Am I with child? Will it be a boy? Will I survive the birth? The Kahun Papyrus offers answers in the form of rituals. It suggests plant-based fertility tests, divination practices, and guidelines for interpreting dreams. One dream, a woman sees herself walking through lotus fields that may mean she carries a daughter. Another sees crocodiles swimming in two directions, a twin pregnancy perhaps. This was not science in our modern sense, but it was pattern and experience shaped over generations of women watching, waiting, learning. Pain that had no name and care that listened anyway. You tell the healer something you can barely say. Sometimes, when you lie with your husband, it hurts, or maybe it feels like grief. She does not say it's in your head. She does not call you hysterical. She places her hands gently over your abdomen, lights incense, and says, "Let us ease the womb's memory, because in this world, the body is not just a machine. It holds sorrow. It remembers things the tongue can't say." The Kahun Papyrus includes diagnoses for what today might be called postpartum depression, endometriosis, or sexual trauma. They didn't have those words, but they had the eyes to see and the ears to hear. Not broken, simply blooming differently. Tonight, as you lie beneath your blanket, your body may ache in places unnamed. Your cycles may confuse you. Your hormones may stir storms no one else sees. But remember this. Once long ago, a scroll was written to honor your complexity. A healer traced your symptoms not as defects, but as signs of sacred transformation. And maybe, just maybe, you are not broken. You are simply changing like the moon, like the tide, like every woman who came before you. You're ill again. Not with a broken bone or a fever, but with something harder to name. Maybe your stomach tightens for no reason. Maybe your dreams have turned sour. Maybe the shadow behind your shoulder just won't leave you alone. So you don't go to the physician with scrolls. You go to the one who listens to what the wind says. She lives at the edge of the village. Her door is low. Inside, it smells of herbs oil and smoke. And on the wall, dozens of small dolls hang by red string, each one a prayer. Each one a patient who once walked out lighter than they came in. Where medicine ends, magic begins. In your time, healing is more than the physical. It's the unseen, what lives in your breath, your aura, your luck. The healer lays her hand on your head and whispers, "Someone has cast an eye on you." Not the eye of science. The evil eye, a stare soaked in envy or hatred, believed to cause misfortune, illness, even death. There's no pill for that. But there is ritual. She brews water infused with thyme, and Rue passes smoke over your chest and chants ancient words not meant to be translated, words meant only to push back the unseen. And something in you loosens. You don't know if it's magic, but it's more than nothing. Charms, names, and secret symbols. She asks for your full name, not just what you're called, but the name your mother whispered when she first held you. Because in magic, names are power. And to speak yours in a certain rhythm at a certain hour is to realign your stars. She draws a circle in ash, places 7 stones around it, and somewhere in the chant, she says your name 3 times, soft, then loud, then silent. You feel a shiver, a release, like something old just left the room, the illness that came from a broken promise. In her world, sickness doesn't always come from germs. Sometimes it comes from words left unsaid, from oaths broken, from a prayer ignored. She asks gently, "Did you forget to light a candle last full moon?" You did. Then we must make it right. Not because she blames you, but because she understands. Healing is restoration, not just of the body, but of your pact with the world. She hands you honey rosemary and a thread of gold. You are to bury the thread under the oldest tree you know, and whisper 3 times, "Let me be seen. Let me be forgiven. Let me be whole." Belief as medicine. You ask her, "Do you really think this will work?" She smiles. "Only if you do." Because the real power of magic is not in the charm. It's in the moment you allow yourself to believe you can be well. It's in giving form to fear so it can be unknotted, in naming pain so it doesn't own you, in rituals so healing feels like something you do, not something you wait for. You're not helpless. You're part of the process. Tonight, before you sleep, close your eyes. Imagine a circle of stones around your bed, a whisper of smoke curling at the edges of your dreams, a name yours spoken by the wind. And know this, you don't have to believe in every charm or chant. But if something inside you softens at the thought of being protected, that softness itself might be the beginning of healing. You're no longer breathing. Your chest has stilled. Your lips are cold. The pulse that once carried prayers through your blood has gone quiet. But this is not the end. Here in ancient Egypt, your death is only a pause, a sacred intermission before a much longer journey. And your body, though, still is about to receive the most delicate care of its entire life. Because now you are entrusted to the hands of the embalmers. And what they do next isn't just burial, it's medicine for your soul. The body is the vessel, the soul is the traveler. You were more than just flesh. You were ka life force, but personality and ox spirit reunited with the gods. And to keep those parts together, your body must be preserved, protected, and perfected, not for beauty, not for memory, but so you could wake again. So the embalmers begin their sacred work. Salt linen and sacred hands, they do not rush. First, they wash your body in palm wine and Nile water. This isn't cleaning. It's cleansing, a ritual, not a routine. Then they make a small cut on your left side. From it, they remove your liver, stomach, lungs, and intestines. Each one is wrapped and placed into a canopic jar, each watched over by a guardian spirit in the shape of an animal-headed god. Your heart is left inside you, or sometimes removed, then returned. It is the seat of your morality, and one day it will be weighed against a feather. But your brain, removed through the nose using a thin hook, because thought to them wasn't as eternal as virtue. Then your body is filled with natron salt to draw out every drop of decay. You will rest like this for 40 days and 40 nights, drying beneath the desert sun as silence holds your name in its palm, wrapped in memory, prayer, and time. After the drying comes the wrapping. Each strip of linen is layered carefully, sometimes hundreds of yards of it, not all at once, piece by piece, joint by joint, toe by toe, finger by finger. And between those layers, they tuck small amulets carved with spells, tiny scarabs to protect your soul, pieces of papyrus bearing the words from the Book of the Dead. Somewhere in those folds, a priest whispers your name. He reads incantations over your heart. He touches your lips with a ritual called the opening of the mouth, so you may speak again in the afterlife. Your body is not just being preserved, it is being prepared to rise. A ceremony of science and spirit. From a modern eye, mummification seems strange, but it is the earliest known fusion of medical procedure and spiritual practice. There is anatomical knowledge here, an understanding of organs, decomposition, and cleanliness. The embalmers knew how long it took for decay to set in. They knew how to prevent infection, how to seal wounds, how to create longevity. But more than that, they knew how to hold grief with reverence. To them, a corpse wasn't a discarded shell. It was the future home of the soul. And every stitch they made, every jar they sealed was a promise. You are not forgotten. You will walk again. You're not dead. You're waiting. Inside the tomb, you lie, wrapped in silence, surrounded by oils jars, statues, and food for the journey. No heartbeat, but no decay. No breath, but no end. Because one day you will stand before Osiris. You will walk the fields of reeds. You will rise perfected because you were cared for as someone who mattered even after your last breath. Tonight, let the thought comfort you. Even death was once treated with a tenderness we barely offer the living. There were hands trained to hold your bones with love. There were rituals to make sure your name echoed beyond the grave. There was a medicine, not of healing the body, but of protecting the journey of your soul. And you're not just a flicker. You're part of something that spans beyond time, a soul worth preparing, a story worth preserving. You're holding a scroll. Its fibers crackle under your fingertips. The ink faded, but firm still whispers instructions across the centuries. You are not a patient now. You are a student. And the building around you is called Peronk, the House of Life. A place that is not quite a hospital, not quite a temple, not quite a school, but somehow it is all of them. The House of Life, more than bricks and books. The House of Life isn't just one room or one city. It exists across Egypt, linked by papyri teachers and sacred purpose. You might find it near a temple attached to the worship of a healing god like Thoth or Sekhmet, or hidden behind the palace walls, where only the most learned are allowed to enter. Inside, the air smells of ink and cedar. The walls are lined with papyrus scrolls stacked, rolled, guarded. You don't speak above a whisper here, because every scroll is a living voice. Every inked diagram of a liver or a lung is a thread that ties you to the ones who healed before you. The medical texts, science inked in sacred script. You sit cross-legged and unroll a scroll. It might be the Eber's papyrus, long and dense, filled with over 700 remedies, or the Hearst papyrus, full of surgical observations and treatments, or maybe the Kahun gynecological papyrus. You've seen it before in the hands of a midwife. You read, to soothe inflammation of the eye, apply a paste of crushed malachite with honey. To quiet a restless mind, place poppy milk beneath the tongue. To close a wound, cleanse with wine seal, with resin bind with linen. There is structure, there is experimentation, but there is also humility. Each scroll begins not with certainty, but with care. Your teachers, scribes, priests, and healers. Your mentor is a scribe who speaks like a poet, but cuts like a surgeon. He once trained at Heliopolis, they say, where the House of Life shines brightest. He teaches you to mix herbs in silence, to memorize the parts of the body, not from diagrams, but from song. Each lesson begins with an offering, not to the gods of war, but to the gods of precision. You learn how to read symptoms from the skin, how to diagnose from pulse posture pain. And when a patient comes to you, you must write everything on a scroll of your own, because the record matters. A healer must remember, training the mind and the hand. You do not touch a patient in your first year. You grind herbs. You recite. You copy texts until your fingers blister. Only when your script is clean, your tone respectful, your thoughts aligned, do you receive your first bronze scalpel. And it is not shiny. It is old, passed down, etched with symbols not for luck, but for responsibility. You're told, this knife does not kill. It reveals. It teaches. Medicine as sacred trust. In the House of Life, knowledge is not just learned, it is inherited. You are taught that healing is a covenant between human and divine, between body and cosmos. You are not just fixing flesh, you are restoring harmony. To treat a fever, you might use willow bark, but you also check the stars, the wind, the last dream your patient had, because illness is not just physical, it's a disruption of order. And your job is to bring it back. And now tonight, you return to your sleeping mat, scrolls stacked beside you. Your hands still smell faintly of myrrh and ink. You are tired, but you are part of something vast. You are one student in a chain of many. You will one day pass down your own scroll. You will teach someone else how to hold a knife without fear. Because in the House of Life, medicine was never just knowledge. It was memory made sacred. You wake up in the present day. Maybe it's a clinic. Maybe a quiet therapy room with soft lighting and calming music. Maybe it's just your kitchen where you sip tea and wait for the pain to pass. But something in the way your healer speaks, in the scent of herbs, in the touch that is both professional and kind. It feels older than the room itself. You might not know it yet, but you're lying in the shadow of a civilization that never truly left. The torch passed to Greece long after the embalmer's hands had stilled, and the scrolls of the House of Life had grown brittle. Another world rose from the sea. Ancient Greece, the supposed cradle of Western medicine, didn't begin in a vacuum. It looked east to the Nile, to the stars of Egypt, to the papyri translated and carried across trade routes. Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine, lived 1,000 years after the Kahun papyrus. But his approach, observation, diagnosis, prognosis, it whispered Egypt. The Greek word for doctor is iatros, but the idea of medicine as sacred practice, as balance as ritual, that belonged first to Egypt. Temples to Asclepius. The Greek god of healing often mimicked Egyptian ones with sleep chambers, dream interpretations, and herbal rituals. Just like the healing sanctuaries along the Nile, the texts survived because they were sacred. When the Library of Alexandria was still young, Egyptian scrolls were copied again and again, translated from hieratic into Greek, from Greek into Arabic, from Arabic into Latin. They passed through the hands of scholars, monks, alchemists, physicians, each one leaving fingerprints of their time. But the heart of the knowledge, how to ease pain, how to honor the body, remained. Even today, some medical recipes are almost unchanged. Honey and vinegar for wounds, willow bark for pain, chamomile for sleep. You use them perhaps without knowing, but they remember you. Holistic healing, a modern echo of ancient balance. You sit in a yoga class. You lie on an acupuncture table. You sip herbal tea while journaling under moonlight. This is not just a trend, it's a return. Ancient Egyptian medicine didn't divide body from mind, didn't isolate symptoms from spirit, didn't see a fever as just heat, but as a sign, a story, a ripple in the whole. That idea of whole person care is now called holistic, but for millennia, it was just called healing. Modern integrative medicine, combining science with meditation, herbal care, and emotional wellness, isn't new. It's old. Older than books. Older than borders. The invisible thread, somewhere in a hospital hallway. Today, a doctor wraps a stethoscope around their neck, but pauses first to ask, "How are you sleeping?" A counselor places a lavender diffuser in their room, not because it's in the manual, but because they know it helps. A mother hums while laying a warm cloth on her child's belly. All of it. A thread pulled from the Nile, tied to scrolls, inked under torchlight, bound with care, belief, and breath. Tonight, you rest under many names. You are not just tired. You are part of a lineage. You're not just treating your body. You're listening to it the way healers once listened to the wind, to the stars, to the silence between heartbeats. You might never walk the halls of the House of Life. You might never unroll a papyrus or chant to Sekhmet. But when you honor your body's story, when you believe in its ability to mend, when you let care be both practical and poetic, you're keeping something ancient alive. You're healing in the way humans always have. As we close the final scroll of this journey, you can almost hear the whisper of papyrus turning in the dark. You've walked beside ancient healers and midwives, scribes and priests, stood in the smoky hush of the House of Life, and listened to the silence between heartbeat and hope. Perhaps now, when you press a warm cloth to your forehead or sip tea before bed, you'll feel the echo of practices thousands of years old, not outdated, but enduring. Not forgotten, but folded gently into the rituals we still carry. Because healing was never just about medicine. It was about listening to the body, to dreams, to the divine, and above all, to ourselves. So, as you lie back and drift into sleep, may you carry with you the quiet wisdom of those who once believed that even the soul needs tending. That healing is a circle, not a cure. And that sleep, yes, even sleep is sacred. If you found comfort in these stories, if you felt your breath slow and your thoughts soften, then I invite you to stay with us. Subscribe to this channel so you'll never miss the next slow starlit journey into the past. There's always more to uncover, always more to remember. But for now, the scroll is closed. The lamp is dim. The healers have gone quiet. And it's your turn to rest. Good night, and thank you for dreaming with us.